On the left, in red ink on a white background, the Arabic word for Coca-Cola is shown. On the right, a picture of a red can is shown. The words Coca-Cola are written in cursive on the right side in white going from the bottom to the top of the can, and the word original is written across the top in English. On the left side of the can are words in the Khmer language. Figure 15. 1. Globalization. Coca-Cola is often used as a symbol of globalization across the world. On the left, Coca-Cola is written in Arabic script. On the right is a can with the name of the product written in both English and Khmer, the primary language in Cambodia. Cuba and North Korea are the only places on Earth where Coke cannot be purchased. Credit left. Modification of work. The official Arabic script logo for Coca-Cola by Hope in Forever. Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit right. Modification of work Coca-Cola can with Khmer equivalent by Treehill /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Chapter outline. 15. 1. A global economy. 15. 2. Debates about the environment. 15. 3. Science and technology for today's world. 15. 4. Ongoing problems and solutions. Few symbols of global trade and Americanization abroad have been as powerful as Coca-Cola. Figure 15. 1. Though it is the most widely consumed soft drink in the world, its conquest of the globe has not been without controversy. Coca-Cola bottlers were accused of interfering with labor union organization in South America in the 1990s, and in 2014, the company was forced to close a bottling plant in northern India that was depriving farmers of water. Today, although Coca-Cola is making an effort to restore the water that it uses in places like India and South Africa, some critics claim that it still uses more than it replenishes. Coke is an apt symbol of the interconnectedness of our contemporary world and the challenges it presents. Many people enjoy the benefits that come with an increasingly globalized economy, but many have also been harmed in the process. A timeline is shown. 1944, World Bank and International Monetary Fund founded. 1955, Jonas Salk licenses the polio vaccine. A picture of a man is shown. 1962, Rachel Carson publishes Silent Spring. A picture of a smiling woman is shown. 1980, smallpox declared eradicated. 1981, AIDS discovered. 1986, Chernobyl disaster. A picture is shown of tall white buildings in front of a blue sky. 1991, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty aims to reduce nuclear weapon stockpiles. 1995, World Trade Organization created. 2001, Al-Qaeda terrorists destroy World Trade Center. A picture is shown of an American flag flying among the rubble of a fallen building. 2010, Arab Spring events oppose authoritarianism. A large group of people is shown converging on a circular area of white tents with tall buildings and trees in the background. 2015, Paris Agreement on Global Warming. Figure 15. 2. Timeline. The contemporary world and ongoing challenges. Credit 1955. Modification of work Dr. Jonas Edward Salk, creator of Salk polio vaccine at Copenhagen Airport, by SAS Scandinavian Airlines /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1962. Modification of work Rachel Carson, author of Silent Spring. Official photo as FWS employee. C. 1940 by USFWS National Digital Library /Wikimedia Commons, CC01. 0. Credit 1986. Modification of work View of Chernobyl taken from Pripyat by Jason Minchell /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 2001. Modification of work New York, NY, September 19, 2001. Rescue workers climb over and dig through piles of rubble from the destroyed World Trade Center as the American flag billows over the debris. By Andrea Bucher /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 2010. Modification of work Tahrir Square during 8 February 2011 by Mona /Flickr, CC by 20. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain how trade agreements and attempts to regulate world trade have shaped the global economy since the 1990s. Analyze the way multinational corporations have affected politics, workers, and the environment in developing nations. Discuss the way globalization has affected workers around the world. In many ways, world wars I and II were only temporary interruptions in a centuries-long process of global integration. This process is often called globalization, the interconnectedness of societies and economies throughout the world as a result of trade, technology, and the adoption and sharing of elements of culture. Globalization facilitates the movement of goods, people, technologies, and ideas across international borders. Historians of globalization note that it has a very long history. In the days of the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty, Europeans and Asians were connected to one another through trade along the Silk Roads. In the 14th century, the Black Death spread from Asia to Europe and North Africa, killing people on all three continents. With the European colonization of the Americas in 16th and 17th centuries and British colonization of Australia, all of the world's inhabited continents became enmeshed in exchanges of peoples, products, and ideas that increased in the 19th century as the result of both technological developments and the imperialist impulses of industrialized nations. Only the world wars of the 20th century brought a temporary halt to these exchanges. Furthermore, once the world wars were over, globalization not only resumed its pre-World War I trajectory, but even gained speed, despite the Cold War and decolonization efforts in Asia and Africa. As the Cold War came to a close, the United States and increasingly powerful corporations ensured that capitalism and free market economics would dominate the globe. Global trade. Even during the Cold War and decolonization, economic development and industrialization continued around the world. Japan and West Germany, destroyed and defeated in the 1940s, were striking examples. Each dove headlong into post-war rebuilding efforts that paid huge dividends. They invested heavily in their economies and saw industrial production and economic growth skyrocket over the 1950s and 1960s. By 1970, both had become economic powerhouses in their regions. Similar but smaller economic miracles occurred in other places, especially in Europe. Spain underwent a period of spectacular growth fueled by imported technology, government funding, and increased tourism and industrialization in the 1960s. Italy began even earlier. By the early 1960s, its annual gross domestic product, GDP, growth, the increase in value of all the goods and services the country was producing, had peaked at just over 8%. France bounced back from the war years with a rise in population and an impressive new consumer culture that became accustomed to a high standard of living and access to modern conveniences like automobiles, televisions, and household appliances. Comparable growth occurred in Belgium, Greece, and the Netherlands. Contributing to this post-war economic growth was the emergence of regional economic cooperation in Western Europe. The process began with the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, in 1951. The original member countries of the ECSC were West Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. To both foster economic integration and preserve the peace, these member states agreed to break down trade barriers between them by creating a common market in steel and coal. Across the 6 countries, these products were allowed to flow without restrictions, like customs duties. The success of the ECSC eventually paved the way for further economic integration in Europe with the formation of the European Economic Community, EEC, also called the Common Market, in 1957. The EEC used the economic cooperation model developed by the ECSC and greatly expanded it to remove trading and investment restrictions across its member states, far beyond just coal and steel. While generally successful, the EEC's efforts at economic integration occasionally met resistance. Farmers who stood to lose economically protested the way it opened national markets to agricultural products produced more cheaply in other countries and sought protectionist policies. Yet despite these protests and concerns, the EEC continued to expand. Although Britain supported the EEC's economic goals, it was initially not interested in the political cooperation the group represented. When it did signal its desire to join, Britain wanted special protections for its agriculture and other exceptions for its Commonwealth connections, such as Canada. This meant negotiating with France, then the EEC's most powerful member. Since decisions at that time were made unanimously, and member countries had the power to unilaterally veto, France's approval was crucial. President Charles de Gaulle of France did not approve, however, and he cut off negotiations with Britain in 1960. Over the next several years, Britain officially applied for EEC membership twice, in 1961 and again in 1967. Both times de Gaulle worried that admitting Britain, with its strong ties to the United States, would transform the organization into an Atlantic community controlled by Washington. Britain was admitted in 1973, along with Denmark and Ireland, when de Gaulle was no longer president of France. But many in the United Kingdom had wanted to stay out, especially those in the Conservative Party. It took a UK referendum in 1975 to confirm the country's EEC membership. In their own words, Charles de Gaulle vetoes British admission to the EEC. In January 1963, French President Charles de Gaulle made the following statement at a press conference, explaining his opposition to Britain's application to join the EEC or Common Market. England, in effect, is insular. She is maritime. She is linked through her exchanges, her markets, her supply lines to the most diverse and often the most distant countries. She pursues essentially industrial and commercial activities, and only slight agricultural ones. She has in all her doings very marked and very original habits and traditions. One might sometimes have believed that our English friends, in posing their candidature to the common market, were agreeing to transform themselves to the point of applying all the conditions which are accepted and practiced by the six founding members: Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany. But the question, to know whether Great Britain can now place herself like the continent, and with it inside a tariff which is genuinely common, to renounce all Commonwealth preferences, to cease any pretense that her agriculture be privileged, and, more than that, to treat her engagements with other countries of the free trade area as null and void. That question is the whole question. Further, this community, increasing in such fashion, would see itself faced with problems of economic relations with all kinds of other states, and first with the United States. It is to be foreseen that the cohesion of its members, who would be very numerous and diverse, would not endure for long, and that ultimately it would appear as a colossal Atlantic community under American dependence and direction, and which would quickly have absorbed the community of Europe. It is a hypothesis which in the eyes of some can be perfectly justified, but it is not at all what France is doing or wanted to do, and which is a properly European construction. Yet it is possible that one day England might manage to transform herself sufficiently to become part of the European community, without restriction, without reserve and preference for anything whatsoever. And in this case, the six would open the door to her and France would raise no obstacle, although obviously England's simple participation in the community would considerably change its nature and its volume. Charles de Gaulle, veto on British membership of the EEC. Why does de Gaulle note that Britain's relationship with the United States is a problem? What does this statement suggest about the special protections Britain wanted in order to become an EEC member? Do you think that de Gaulle was right to worry about the influence of the United States? Why or why not? By 1993, the EEC had been integrated into the newly created European Union, EU, which had grown to 15 member states by 1995, and in 2022 included 27 member states, figure 15. 3. The EU was conceived as a single market for the free movement of goods, services, money, and people. Citizens of member countries can freely move to other EU countries and legally work there, just as they can in their own country. In 1999, the EU introduced its own currency, the euro. Initially used only for commercial and financial transactions in 11 of the EU countries, euro notes and coins had become the legal currency in the majority of EU countries by the start of 2002. The euro was not universally adopted by member states, though. The United Kingdom, Denmark, Sweden, and a few others kept their own currencies. The adoption of the euro was swiftly followed by a major expansion of the EU to include several Central and Eastern European countries including Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. A map of Europe is shown. Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, Ireland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Croatia, Cyprus, Slovenia, and Austria are highlighted blue. The rest of Europe is highlighted gray. Figure 15. 3. The European Union. From the 6 founding states, Belgium, France, West Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, that signed the Treaty of Paris in the early 1950s, the European Union has grown to include 27 member states in 2022. Credit, modification of work, European Union map by S. Solberg / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In 2016, however, 52% of the citizens of the United Kingdom voted to leave the EU, and Britain officially cut its ties with the organization, its largest trading partner, on January 31, 2020. Some EU opponents in the United Kingdom had claimed the group was economically dysfunctional, especially after the recession of 2008, and that it reduced British sovereignty. Many also disliked the fact that its membership in the EU made it easier for people from elsewhere in Europe, including recent immigrants from the Middle East and Africa, to enter Britain. Those who wanted to stay argued that leaving would hurt British trade with Europe and make Britain poorer. Some also argued that losing the trade advantages that came with belonging to the EU could result in shortages in stores and more expensive products. The breakup, colloquially known as Brexit, was hardly amicable. In Britain, many who supported staying in the EU were shocked by the decision and demanded a re-vote, though none was taken. In Europe, the European Parliament, the EU's legislative body, was angry that Brexit might threaten the entire EU project. To show its displeasure and possibly to deter any other member states from leaving, the European Parliament wanted the separation to be as painful for the United Kingdom as possible, and many member countries supported this hardline stance. In today's post-Brexit world, there are new regulations on British goods entering the EU, and no automatic recognition of British professional licenses in the EU. Britons seeking to make long-term stays in EU countries now must apply for visas. Among the forces driving European economic integration was a desire for Europe to be more independent of the United States. This wish was understandable given the massive economic and political power the United States began wielding after World War II. Not only did the United States possess a huge military force with a global reach and growing installations in Europe and beyond, but its economic strength was the envy of the world. Having experienced the Great Depression in the years before the war, the United States emerged after it as an economic powerhouse with a highly developed industrial sector. More importantly, with the exception of the attack on Pearl Harbor, it had avoided the wartime destruction experienced in Europe and Asia. As a result, Not only was it able to provide funds to war-torn nations to rebuild their economies and their infrastructure as part of the Marshall Plan, but U.S. manufactured goods also flooded into markets around the world. By 1960, U.S. GDP had grown to $543 billion a year in current dollars. By comparison, the United Kingdom had the second largest economy with a GDP of $73 billion in current dollars. The economic might of the United States brought unprecedented growth and a rise in the population's standard of living in the decades after the war. With ready access to well-paying industrial jobs, the middle class boomed in the 1950s and 1960s. Their buying having been restrained during the war years because of the rationing of goods, consumers were eager to use their wartime savings to purchase new automobiles, televisions, household appliances, and suburban homes. Many enjoyed steady employment with new Union I benefits like weekends off and paid vacations. They also began sending their children to college in ever greater numbers. By 1960, about 3.6 million young students were enrolled in higher education, an increase of 140% over the previous 2 decades. For many, access to higher education was the gateway to the middle or upper class. By the 1970s, the U.S. economy began to cool, partially because of domestic inflation and increased competition from abroad. Oil embargoes by Arab nations belonging to the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, in retaliation for U.S. support of Israel during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, and a general strategy by oil-producing nations to raise their prices, further stressed the economy by creating gas shortages for consumers. Other countries that had supported Israel, such as the Netherlands, also suffered from the embargo. Once dominant in most major industrial sectors, including the production of steel and automobiles around the world, by the end of the 1970s, U.S. manufacturers were suffering as a result of competition from Japan and Western Europe. This reality led to a number of difficult economic transformations in the United States, but it also encouraged some national leaders to seek regional international economic integration along lines similar to Western Europe's achievement. Beginning in the 1980s, the United States and Canada entered into negotiations to create their own regional free trading zone. This made sense because Canada not only shared a long border with the United States, but was also its largest trading partner. In 1988, the two countries agreed to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, Canada-US FTA, which eliminated barriers to the movement of goods and services between the two. Almost immediately, Mexico signaled its interest in creating a similar free trade agreement with the United States. U.S. President Ronald Reagan had floated the concept during his 1980 election campaign, but successful completion of the Canada-US FTA convinced Mexican leaders that the time was ripe to act on the idea. Ultimately, Canada joined the plan with Mexico as well, and by the end of 1992, all three countries had signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, Figure 15.4. The intent of NAFTA was to reduce trade barriers and allow goods to flow freely among the three countries. Despite considerable resistance within the United States, largely from industrial workers who feared their factories and jobs would be relocated to Mexico, where wages were far lower, the agreement was ratified by all three countries and went into effect in 1994. Two images are shown. The picture on the left shows two men and one woman sitting at a table with a bright blue tablecloth, looking down at the table with pens in their hands. Three men stand behind them. The man on the left sitting down has a dark suit, red and blue striped tie, mustache, and is balding on the sides. The woman sitting next to him is wearing a pink jacket, a pink and white blouse, and has short brown hair. The last man sitting on the right has a dark suit, white shirt, and polka dot tie. His hair is silver and he wears glasses. The three men standing behind them all wear dark suits, white shirts, and ties. The man on the left has a mustache and is bald on top, while the other two men have black and silver hair. Behind them are four flags, going from left to right. The first one is green on the top and then white with a red image on it. The next one shows a blue background with white stars. Then the next one is red on top, and the last one has red on top then white with a red point sticking out. There is a large tree behind them with green leaves. B. The image on the right shows North and South America, Europe, Africa, and most of Asia along with the equator. All of North America and half of Central America are highlighted yellow, and the rest of the countries are highlighted white. Figure 15. For North American Free Trade Agreement. A. At the signing ceremony for NAFTA in October 1992, Mexican President Carlos Salinas de Gortari, U.S. President George H.W. Bush and Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, left to right, stand behind their respective trade secretaries. B. The three countries had spent several years hammering out the agreement. Credit A. Modification of work, NAFTA initialing ceremony, October 1992, by George Bush Presidential Library and Museum/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit B. World Map Blank Shorelines by Maciej Jarrow/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The creation of Canada-US FTA and later NAFTA represented an important policy shift for the United States. Until the early 1980s, the country had largely avoided limited regional trading deals, preferring instead to seek comprehensive global agreements. Such efforts had begun relatively soon after World War II in the form of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT), signed in 1947 by 23 countries. Initially conceived as a way to reinforce other post-war economic recovery efforts, GATT was designed to prevent the re-emergence of pre-war-style trade barriers, to lower trade barriers overall, and to create a system for arbitrating international trade disputes. Since its initial acceptance in 1947, GATT has undergone a number of revisions, completed in sessions referred to as rounds, to promote free trade and international investments. In 1995, at the Uruguay Round, GATT transformed itself into the World Trade Organization, WTO, and cleared the path for free trade among 123 countries. Like GATT, the intent of the WTO was to support international trade, reduce trade barriers, and resolve trade disputes between countries. Unlike GATT, however, the WTO is not a free trade agreement. Rather, it is an organization that ensures non-discriminatory trade between WTO countries. This means that trade barriers are allowed, but they must apply equally to all members. Many observers saw the creation of the WTO as a triumph of globalization, or the emergence of a single integrated global economy. China joined in 2001, a clear sign of its integration into global market systems. Because the WTO is regarded as a major force for globalization, its meetings often attract protesters who oppose corporate power and the economic, political, and cultural influence of wealthy nations in the developed world on less developed nations. In 1999, in Seattle, Washington, a diverse group of students, labor union representatives, environmentalists, and activists of many kinds protested the abuses associated with globalization. Police confronted activists staging marches and sit-ins with rubber bullets and tear gas, and trade talks ground to a halt. Meetings of the WTO continue to attract protesters. As the creation of the EU and NAFTA demonstrate, the signing of international trade agreements like GATT, which was ratified by countries on 6 continents, did not prevent regions from establishing their own free trade blocs like MERCOSUR, the South American trading bloc created in 1991. Nor have such blocs been confined to the West. The most notable to emerge in Asia are the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC. Figure 15.5. Two images are shown. A. The image on the left shows a rectangular stamp. In the middle is the image of a lady standing in a grassy field in front of a tree and mountains. She is wearing a pink, long-sleeved shirt, brown and white striped skirt, heeled sandals, and a blue scarf over her left shoulder while holding a wooden, slatted instrument. Below her the words Republic Indonesia are written in red, and above her head the words Visit ASEAN Lands 1971 are also written in red. Angklung is written along the right from top to bottom in red. At the left in blue is the number 50. Across the top of the stamp on the left is a maroon pentagon with a gridded circle and a bird drawn inside. In the middle are the words Visit ASEAN Lands in blue with 1971 written on the right in maroon. Along the left side of the stamp in blue, white, and yellow is a drawing of an elephant with their trunk up among flower and tree designs, and a pointy yellow mountain in the background and blue striped swirling clouds. Along the right side there are papayas, bananas, pineapples, and other various fruits drawn in yellow with blue designs surrounding them. Across the bottom of the picture is a drawing of a horse pulling a covered carriage with a driver in white and blue on a yellow background with flowers. B. The image on the right side shows land and islands in Southeast Asia. The areas are highlighted varying shades of green. The countries and their colors are from north to south. Myanmar dark green, Laos green, Vietnam light green, Thailand light green, Philippines dark green, Cambodia dark green, Brunei light green, Malaysia green, Singapore dark green, and Indonesia dark green. Figure 15. 5 Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This 1971 postage stamp A from Indonesia celebrates the country's membership in ASEAN, whose member countries are highlighted in the map B. Credit A. Modification of work stamp of Indonesia, 1971. Callneck 257,406. Visit ASEAN Southeast Asian Nations Association Year. By Callneck/Wikimedia Commons. Public domain. Credit B. Modification of work map of ASEAN member states by Haribonagel 927/Wikimedia Commons. Public domain. ASEAN had its beginnings in the 1960s when Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand agreed to cooperate economically to foster regional development and resist the expansion of communism in Asia. Largely successful, the organization expanded in the 1980s and 1990s to include more countries. By the early 2000s, it was openly advocating the creation of EU-style integration in the area. APEC, launched in 1989, was in many ways a response to the growth of regional trading blocs like ASEAN and the EEC. Initially composed of 12 Asia-Pacific countries including Australia, the United States, South Korea, and Singapore, it has since grown to include Mexico, China, Chile, Russia, and more. It promotes free trade and international economic cooperation among its members, multinationals, and the push to privatize. The growing global economic integration, represented by the rise of the WTO and regional trading blocs, opened new opportunities for multinational corporations to extend their reach and influence around the world. A multinational corporation, or MNC, is a corporate business entity that controls the production of goods and services in multiple countries. MNCs are not new. Some, like the British East India Company and the Hudson's Bay Company, exerted great influence during Europe's imperial expansion in the early modern and modern periods. But with globalization and improvements in transportation and communication technology, MNCs have thrived, especially since the 1950s. They have used their growing wealth to lobby governments to create conditions favorable to their operation, enabling them to become even more powerful. Multinationals have also benefited greatly from the lowering of trading barriers around the world. These developments have encouraged major automobile manufacturers like Volkswagen, Toyota, Chevrolet, IKEA and Nissan to build and operate assembly plants in Mexico. For example, where workers are paid lower wages than they are in countries like Germany, Japan, South Korea, or the United States. This translates to significant cost savings and thus higher profits for them. And because Mexico is part of a free trade bloc with the United States and Canada, cars made there can be exported for sale in the United States or Canada without the need to pay tariffs. Supporters of MNCs claim that the benefits for workers in this arrangement are also substantial. They get access to well-paying and reliable industrial jobs not available before, and their paychecks flow into the local community and contribute to a general rise in the standard of living. The companies themselves invest in local infrastructure like roads, power lines, and factories, and their presence often helps expand support industries like restaurants that cater to workers and shipping companies that employ them to move their goods. Technology spillovers also occur when MNCs either help to develop necessary job skills in local workers or introduce new technologies that ultimately become available to domestic industries in the host country. Finally, MNCs that focus on retail and establish branches in other countries, such as Walmart, Aldi, Costco, Carrefour, IKEA, and many more, provide access to high-quality consumer goods like clothing, appliances, and electronics at competitive prices, raising the standard of living in the countries where they operate. Figure 15. 6. A picture shows the corner of a large, bricked building. The two sides shown are brown bricked with a beige stripe of bricks toward the top. 3 windows are shown toward the front with doors in the middle. A beige flat surface shows at the two sides of the corner with an orange rectangle, blue A, and the word Aldi in white on both sides. Along the left of the front, there are shopping carts in 2 rows along the front wall, and on the right side of the middle post, there is a beige garbage can. Through the windows you can see lights and some store shelves. The ground outside is wet and snow is seen in the 2 bottom corners. There are some trees and gray skies in the background. Figure 15. 6 multinational corporations. Aldi is a multinational chain of grocery stores based in Germany with branches in 20 different countries. This Aldi store is in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Credit: Aldi in Bethlehem, PA, taken at sunset by Michael Katz / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. There are drawbacks, however. Critics of MNCs note that while workers may be paid more than they could earn working for local businesses, they are still paid far less than the multinational can afford. Workers are often prevented from forming unions and forced to work long hours in unsafe environments. Furthermore, many multinationals are based in developed countries, mostly in the West, and they tend to express the interests and cultural norms of those countries. This bias has sometimes led to accusations of neocolonialism, the use of economic, political, or cultural power by developed countries to influence or control less developed countries, particularly for the way MNCs have helped accelerate the homogenization of cultures around the world by exporting not only goods from the West, but also ideas and behaviors. Link to learning. These short Planet Money videos follow the manufacture of a simple t-shirt and reveal how many people around the world are involved. Click on Chapters to navigate among the 5 short videos. One such idea is that countries should encourage the privatization of public services like utilities, transportation systems, and postal services. Privatization means delegating these services to mostly private companies that operate to earn a profit rather than such services being delivered by arms of the government. Organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, have pushed for privatization as a way to make these public services more efficient. The World Bank is an international organization that offers financing and support to developing countries seeking to improve their economies. Founded in 1944 to rebuild countries after World War II, it later shifted its focus to global development. The IMF, also created in 1944, promotes global monetary stability by helping countries improve their economies with fiscal plans and sometimes loans. In exchange, it requires countries to adopt plans that often include privatizing public services and paying off their debts. In some places, this privatization process has been successful. For decades after independence, for instance, India employed a mixed economy strategy, with a combination of free market policies and heavy intervention by the government. The result, however, was that a large part of the public sector operated under cumbersome bureaucratic controls that critics complained slowed economic growth. Beginning in the 1990s, new leadership in India began pursuing economic liberalization by privatizing aspects of its large public sector including airlines, shipbuilding, telecommunications, electric power, and heavy industry. As expected, these efforts increased productivity and efficiency, but the public often was confronted by higher prices and loss of access to services. The World Bank made similar efforts across Latin America. Some view privatization there as largely successful, noting that as the number of state-owned industries declined, the profitability and efficiency of the privatized companies increased. But sometimes, as in Bolivia, privatization came at considerable cost. In 1999, the Bechtel Corporation, a U.S.-based multinational, was awarded a contract by the Bolivian city of Cochabamba to improve the efficiency of the city's water delivery system. By January 2000, however, water delivery in Cochabamba had actually become worse. Service rates increased even for people who did not receive any water at all. This result led to large and sometimes violent protests, later known as the Cochabamba Water War. The Bolivian government sided with the protesters, expelled Bechtel, and passed the Bolivian water law in April 2000. Water in Bolivia was no longer privatized. In the aftermath of the protests, which drew international media attention, the World Bank promised to study and revise its procedures and recommendations. Multinationals have been crucial in the emergence of modern China as an economic powerhouse. Starting in the 1970s under Deng Xiaoping, the country began to pursue a market-based growth strategy, adopting some of the tools of capitalist economies without ending its communist system. These economic changes, sometimes called the opening of China, vastly changed the country's role in the world's economy and improved a new generation's prospects for a higher standard of living. Factories constructed for MNCs in coastal cities like Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen were filled with workers from the Chinese countryside. Large ships stacked high with Chinese factory-made products crossed the Pacific and Indian Oceans and passed through the Suez and Panama Canals. With the world's largest population, China holds its largest group of consumers. In 2001, it joined the WTO, and in 2010 it became the world's second largest economy after the United States. As of 2022, China's economy was predicted to become the world's largest in 2030. Exporting culture. Besides promoting controversial ideas like privatization, MNCs, many of which are headquartered in the United States, also are responsible for exporting elements of Western culture, especially popular culture. Although many people around the world enjoy such things as Western fashions, movies and television shows, popular music, and fast food, other people fear that such influences harm local cultures and contribute to the Americanization and homogenization of the world. Few countries have been as culturally influential as the United States, thanks to its global dominance after World War II. U.S. troops at military bases around the world were often the first to expose their hosts in Europe and Asia to American traditions, sports, and norms. Consumers around the world purchased a wide range of made in USA products, including Coca-Cola, Levi's jeans, and Hollywood movies, which, along with American music, helped to spread the American dialect of the English language. Some early Americanization efforts were intentional. such as in Germany and Japan, where the goal was to lay a foundation for U.S.-style democracy by projecting ideas like freedom and affluence via popular culture. These ideas were also attractive in South Korea and South Vietnam. Typically, young people patronized fast food restaurants like McDonald's and Pizza Hut, purchased blue jeans and t-shirts, watched American television shows, and sought out recordings of the latest popular music. The popularity of American culture led many countries to fear the loss of their own unique cultural characteristics and the weakening of their domestic industries. Brazil, Greece, Spain, South Korea, and others imposed screen quotas, limiting the hours theaters could show foreign movies. In 1993, France forced the nation's radio stations to allocate 40% of their airtime to exclusively French music. Hollywood movies and American recording artists are still major players, but in the 21st century, diversity has returned to the global stage. Japanese anime and manga have become global phenomena. South Korean K-pop bands like BTS, iKON, and GOT7 have gained audiences in the United States, Europe, and across Asia, figure 15-7. In 2021, the Korean-made serial thriller Squid Game became the most-watched Netflix show of all time. Korean television dramas are also very popular in Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines. Korean popular culture borrows American cultural styles but invigorates them with distinctly Korean elements. For example, K-pop, with its large groups and flashy choreographed dancing, was clearly influenced by hip-hop. K-pop itself is thus a potent reminder that globalization is often the product of cultural sharing, rather than a one-directional flow of cultural norms. A picture is shown of 4 women on a stage with a blue and orange confetti-lit background. The women are all Asian and wear black, double-breasted, long-sleeved jackets, black shorts, and tall black boots. The woman on the left holds a microphone in her left hand, is looking down, and has red lipstick and long curly brown hair on the right side of her head and short black hair on the left. The next woman has short, straight black hair, dark eye makeup, and is holding her right hand up to her face, facing to her right. The next 2 women stand with their backs to each other, facing out, hands on their hips. The one on the left has long black hair and the one on the right has short brownish hair. They both have dark eye makeup. There are 2 yellow strobe lights shining behind them, one on the left and one on the right. Figure 15. 7 K-pop. K-pop groups like the award-winning Brown Eyed Girls mix Korean themes with American-style pop music and dance. Credit: Korean pop group Brown Eyed Girls perform at MTV Exit Concert in Hanoi. By USAID Vietnam/Flickr, public domain. Winners and losers in a globalizing world. While it is tempting to see globalization and the rise of MNCs as generally benefiting the people of developed countries, the reality is more complex. Improvements in transportation and MNCs, use of labor resources in countries around the world, have sometimes harmed workers in developed countries like the United States. Supporters of NAFTA, for example, argued that the United States would benefit from reduced trade barriers, lower prices for agricultural goods from Mexico, and newly available jobs for lower-wage workers. Opponents, however, recognized that the groups hardest hit by transformations in the labor market would be those least able to withstand the damage, mainly working-class manufacturing workers in the United States and Canada. Both sets of predictions proved accurate. After NAFTA was implemented in 1994, trade and development across the 3 participating countries surged. Trade across the U.S. Mexico border surpassed $480 billion by 2015, an inflation-adjusted increase of 465% over the pre-NAFTA total. A similar, if smaller, increase occurred in U.S. Canadian trade during the same time. In Mexico, per capita GDP grew by more than 24%, topping $9,500. Even more impressive growth occurred in Canada and the United States. But between 1993 and 2021, the United States lost nearly 18 million manufacturing jobs when some companies found it more profitable to relocate to Mexico. Not all these job losses can be attributed to NAFTA, but many can, as manufacturing that otherwise would have taken place in the United States was moved to maquiladoras, factories in Mexico along the U.S. border that employ people for low wages. Maquiladoras often receive materials from U.S. manufacturers, transform them into finished products, and then ship them back to the United States for the manufacturers to use. After the passage of NAFTA, U.S. car manufacturers began to make use of parts produced inexpensively in Mexico that would have been much more expensive had they been produced in the United States. For example, in 2015, Brake Parts Inc. moved its operations from California to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, and almost 300 U.S. workers lost their jobs in the process. Workers in the automobile industry, once the backbone of the U.S. industrial sector, suffered as jobs and automotive plants were relocated to Mexico. Some economists, however, argue that the use of inexpensive parts produced in maquiladoras allowed the U.S. automobile industry to survive. Jobs in the clothing industry also declined 85%. There were simply fewer obvious advantages to keeping such jobs in the United States. Economists say the loss of manufacturing jobs was less a result of NAFTA than of other structural economic changes in the United States, such as automation. And while many U.S. workers lost their jobs as a result of NAFTA, millions of others found work in industries that produced goods for sale in Mexico. Nevertheless, the impression that NAFTA and globalization have brought poverty and misery to the working class in the United States remains strong and has influenced the nation's politics since the 1990s. Responding to these beliefs, in 2017, President Donald Trump instigated a renegotiation of NAFTA, creating the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. The USMCA included strong property rights protections, compelled Canada to open its dairy market more broadly, and required that workers in the automotive sector in all three countries be paid competitive wages. The agreement replaced NAFTA and went into effect in 2020. The complaints that arose during the NAFTA debates had been voiced for decades. Since the 1970s, many in the United States had argued that globalization allowed Japan, its enemy during World War II, to race ahead and outcompete domestic manufacturers. By the 1980s, Japan was exporting a huge volume of consumer electronics and automobiles into the U.S. market. Its economic resurgence created a massive trade deficit, the difference in value between what a country imports and what it exports, in the United States, and rising concerns about its global competitiveness. Political figures like Walter Mondale, the 1984 Democratic Party nominee for president, called the trade deficit a threat to the United States and spoke in dire terms about an emerging global trade war. Many others drew connections between Japan's economic rise and growing unemployment in the United States. Auto workers were especially vocal, declaring that Japan was using unfair practices and artificially limiting the number of American cars that could be sold in Japan, figure 15. 8. While the reality was more complicated, politicians were primed to respond with tough talk and reforms. In 1981, President Reagan pressured Japan to limit the number of cars it exported to the United States. The United States also made efforts to limit the importation of foreign steel and semiconductors for the same reasons. A picture of the side of a small hatchback, two-door, orange car is shown on white pavement. The car has black wheels with gray hubcaps, a black and silver back bumper, a rear-view mirror on the right side of the front hood, and red lights with silver grates on the back. The word Honda is across the back in silver lettering. A driver is sitting inside the right side of the car in front of the steering wheel with the window rolled down. Other orange and red cars are seen in the background as well as a man in a white shirt walking. Figure 15. 8 made in Japan. Small, fuel-efficient Japanese cars like this 1970s-era Honda Civic grew increasingly popular in the United States during the 1970s and 1980s, prompting American automotive workers to complain that Japanese car companies were using unfair trade practices. Credit: Honda Civic RS rear by TTTNIS/Wikimedia Commons, CC010. By the start of the 1990s, Japan's economic engine was starting to cool, and so were American concerns about Japanese dominance. However, companies in the developed world faced challenges rooted in the high cost of living and resulting high wages they had to pay to their employees. Globalization offered a solution in the form of outsourcing and offshoring. Outsourcing occurs when a company hires an outside firm, sometimes abroad, to perform tasks it used to perform internally, like accounting, payroll, human resources, and data processing services. Offshoring occurs when a company continues to conduct its own operations, but physically moves them overseas to access cheaper labor markets. Outsourcing and offshoring were hardly new in the 1990s, but with globalization, trade agreements like NAFTA, and the ability to ship goods around the world, they became a major cost savings option for large companies. Trade agreements like NAFTA made it possible to build plants in Mexico and still sell the products they produced in the United States. Companies could also offshore some of their operations to countries in Asia where labor was much cheaper. Those hired overseas experienced their own problems. However, because outsourcing often led to the rise of sweatshops, factories where poorly paid workers labor in dangerous environments. Images of women and children in horrific working conditions in Central America, India, and Southeast Asia circulated around the developed world in the 1990s as examples of the consequences of outsourcing. Major MNCs like Nike, Gap, Forever 21, Walmart, Victoria's Secret, and others have been harshly criticized for using sweatshops to produce their shoes and clothing lines. In 2013, the plight of sweatshop workers gained widespread attention when a building called Rana Plaza, a large complex of garment factories in Bangladesh, collapsed, killing 1,134 and injuring another 2,500 of the low-wage workers who made clothing for luxury brands like Gucci, Versace, and Moncler. The disaster led to a massive protest in Bangladesh demanding better wages and reforms. In the aftermath, studies and inspections of similar factories revealed that almost none had adequate safety infrastructure in place. The past meets the present. Sweatshops and factory safety, then and now. On March 25, 1911, a fire started at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City that caused the deaths of 146 workers, most of them immigrant women and girls of Italian or Jewish heritage. It was soon discovered that the factory had poor safety features, and the doors were locked during the workday, making it impossible for the workers to flee. News of the tragedy spread quickly in New York and around the country. Government corruption, which was widely reported, had allowed the factory to continue operating despite its poor conditions and safety deficiencies. In the end, the tragedy led to massive protests in New York. The city even set up a factory investigating commission to prevent such events from happening again. Just over a century later in Bangladesh, a similar tragedy occurred. On April 24, 2013, the Rana Plaza building collapsed, killing 1,134 workers and injuring thousands of others. The owners of the garment factories housed in the building knew it had structural problems, but still demanded that employees continue to work or lose their jobs. A massive public outcry in Bangladesh followed the building's collapse. People were outraged by the disaster, and by the fact that the workers made some of the lowest wages in the world sewing garments for major multinational companies. The public demanded that the families be compensated, and those responsible be prosecuted, leading many of the garment companies to donate money to the families of those lost. The disaster also inspired a public movement to make the garment industry in Bangladesh more transparent. Why do you think it remains difficult to get garment factories like these to prioritize safety? Beyond the obvious, what are some of the similarities between the two tragedies? Linked to learning. To better understand the similarities between the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and the Rana Plaza collapse, view photos of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and read interviews with survivors of the fire. Then look at the photo essay covering the Rana Plaza collapse by award-winning photographer and activist Taslima Akhtar. The multinational technology company, Apple Inc., has faced intense criticism in recent years for its use of foreign-owned sweatshops in Asia. Since the early 2000s, reports of sprawling factories with hundreds of thousands of workers assembling iPhones have made the news and led to a public relations nightmare for the company. Investigative journalists have revealed that workers suffer a pattern of harsh and humiliating punishments, fines, physical assaults, and withheld wages. In some instances, conditions in the factories have pushed assembly line workers to commit suicide rather than continue. Apple has insisted it takes all such accusations seriously and has tried to end relationships with such assembly plants. But those familiar with the problems have complained that little progress has been made. Even when MNCs commit to providing a safe working environment and fair wages abroad, the practice of subcontracting often makes this impossible to guarantee. Foreign companies to whom multinationals send work often distribute it among a number of smaller companies that may also subcontract it. In turn, it is sometimes difficult for MNCs to know exactly where their goods are actually produced, and thus to enforce rules about wages and working conditions. Multinationals have harmed the countries in which they operate in other ways as well, including deforestation and the depletion of clean, drinkable water. They are also major producers of greenhouse gases and responsible for air pollution and the dumping of toxic waste. MNCs leave little in the way of profit in the countries they exploit, so funds are often lacking to repair or mitigate the damage they do. The desire for a better life and opportunities in the developed world has led many in the developing world to migrate. Millions of immigrants from Mexico and other parts of Latin America have made their way into the United States over the last few decades. They typically find low-paid labor harvesting crops, cleaning homes, and serving as caretakers for children. In these jobs, they serve an important role in the U.S. economy, often doing work domestic workers are unwilling to do. Many enter the country illegally and live and work in the shadows to avoid deportation. This makes them vulnerable to abuse, and they are sometimes preyed on by human traffickers and unscrupulous employers. The United States is not the only country where this dynamic occurs. Saudi Arabia, for example, depends heavily on foreign workers to fill jobs Saudi Arabian citizens are reluctant to take, such as caretaker or domestic servant. Some workers have reported physical and emotional abuse to international human rights watchdog organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. Being immigrants, they often have little access to relief from the country's justice system. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the reasons for the rise of environmentalism around the world, identify ways in which environmental groups have faced resistance, describe the ways in which the global community has attempted to address environmental issues like climate change. While concern for the earth and anxiety about the negative effects humans have wrought is hardly new. The modern environmental movement, with its characteristic public activism, has roots in 19th-century reactions to industrialization. Writers of that time, like George Perkins Marsh, John Ruskin, Octavia Hill, and many others, expressed a romantic view of nature that contrasted sharply with the industrial transformations they witnessed around them. Their ideas gave birth to preservation efforts and the creation of national parks, first in the United States and later in Australia, South Africa, India, and nations in Europe. Environmental concern has only grown stronger as societies around the world must now grapple with the enormous and ongoing consequences of increasing industrialization, manifested particularly in the global threat of climate change. The rise of environmentalism. In the post-World War II period, as the United States and Europe experienced unprecedented economic growth and a rapidly rising standard of living, anxiety regarding the condition of the environment rose to the surface and gained political significance. In the developed West, members of the generation reaching maturity in the 1960s occasionally struggled with their affluence and the recognition that it came with disastrous environmental consequences. These consequences were not limited to the developed world. In the 1950s and 1960s, as part of the Green Revolution, agricultural scientists developed new high-yielding varieties of rice and wheat and synthetic fertilizers and pesticides that increased food production in both the developed and the developing world. The result was that millions were saved from hunger and infant mortality in developing nations decreased. Scientist Norman Borlaug, who was considered largely responsible for the Green Revolution, received a Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his work. Such benefits, however, came with a heavy price tag in many ways. Small farmers had to borrow money to purchase the new high-yielding seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides, and many found themselves deeply in debt. Reliance on the new varieties of crops reduced biodiversity, and chemical fertilizers and pesticides polluted the soil and water. In 1962, Rachel Carson published her best-selling book Silent Spring, which railed against the proliferation of dangerous pesticides like DDT, Figure 15. 9. Carson drew connections between the political power of the chemical industry and the many adverse effects of chemicals that made their way into food supplies and human bodies. Though strongly condemned by large chemical companies, the book was undeniably influential. It was a finalist for the National Book Awards for nonfiction, and its ideas inspired a generation of young activists. In 1972, the use of DDT in U.S. agriculture was banned. A black and white headshot photo of a woman is shown on a gray background. She is smiling, has short wavy hair, almond-shaped eyes, and a pointy nose. She is wearing a white pointy collared shirt and gray jacket with no trim. Figure 15. 9. Rachel Carson. Before writing Silent Spring, Rachel Carson spent years working as a biologist for the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries. After the publication of her book, she was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters and posthumously received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Credit: Rachel Carson, author of Silent Spring. Official photo as FWS employee. C. 1940, by USFWS National Digital Library /Wikimedia Commons, CC 010. Carson's book tapped into the growing anxiety of many who felt the economic growth from which they benefited was environmentally unsustainable. These fears were confirmed by a series of ecological disasters that galvanized public attention. They included the 1958 Niger Delta oil spill in Nigeria, the 1962 start of the Centralia mine fire in Pennsylvania, which is still burning, the 1967 Torrey Canyon oil spill in the United Kingdom, the 1969 Cuyahoga River fire in Ohio, and the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill. By the 1970s, environmental concerns had translated into political action. In April 1970, approximately 20 million people in the United States participated in the world's first Earth Day celebration, a grassroots movement intended to raise public awareness about the environment. Figure 15. 10. A photo is shown of a lawn, trees, and a large white building with a rounded front in the background. In the right forefront of the picture, a man and a woman are shown. The woman is wearing a pale blue dress, heeled white shoes, and has curly short hair. She is holding a white shovel with a red, white, and blue striped ribbon tied to it. There is dirt on the shovel. To her right is a pile of dirt, and to her left is a small tree with the ground dug up around it. To the right stands a man in a blue suit, white shirt, and tie looking down at the small tree. In the background there are white and red buses, people walking around, and a bench by each of two trees. Figure 15. 10 Earth Day 1970. The first Earth Day celebrations even encouraged President Richard Nixon, with First Lady Pat Nixon, to contribute by planting a tree on the White House lawn. Credit: President and Mrs. Richard Nixon plant a tree on the White House South Lawn to recognize the first Earth Day. WHPOC 631111A. By Executive Office of the President of the United States / Wikimedia Commons, Public Domain. In 1972, scientist Donella Meadows and others from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology published a report called The Limits to Growth, which used computer models to predict that humanity would soon reach absolute limits on its use of resources, with disastrous consequences. The report had been commissioned by the Club of Rome, a nonprofit group of scientists, economists, and other intellectuals founded in 1968 to address global problems like pollution and environmental degradation. The Limits to Growth circulated widely and reinforced public concerns about a widespread environmental crisis on Earth. Over the next decade, green parties, political parties organized around environmental concerns, proliferated in countries around Europe, proving popular with the young and highly educated. Some Green Party founders, such as Petra Kelly of the German Green Party, had studied in the United States and were influenced by its environmental movement. By the 1990s, there were Green parties in almost every country in Europe and also in the United States, Canada, Argentina, Chile, Australia, and New Zealand. One of the factors motivating Green parties in Europe was growing concern about nuclear technology. Following the 1951 creation of the first nuclear reactor for producing energy, nuclear power plants became common in the United States, Europe, and the Soviet Union. Once hailed as a cleaner alternative to polluting coal-burning power, nuclear energy began to stall as environmentally conscious populations around the world voiced concerns about its potential dangers. News of the partial meltdown of the 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania in 1979 gave new vigor to the already strong anti-nuclear movement. Still considered the worst nuclear accident in U.S. history, the 3 Mile Island disaster released radioactive gases through the plant and into the surrounding area. After news of it reached the public, more than 100,000 residents fled the area. Despite President Jimmy Carter's efforts to calm the public, the event shattered the country's belief that such plants could be operated safely. Just a few years later, in 1986, an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, which was then part of the Soviet Union, resulted in the single largest uncontrolled radioactive release ever recorded. Although the Soviet Union reported that only 31 people died as a direct result of the accident, more than 200,000 had to be resettled in the wake of the disaster. And in 2005, the United Nations estimated that another 4,000 could still die as a result of exposure to radiation released in Chernobyl. The area around Chernobyl was declared off-limits, and the Soviet Union suffered irreparable harm to its reputation as a competent and technologically advanced superpower. In their own words, Voices from Chernobyl. The 1986 Chernobyl catastrophe in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, required the creation of an exclusion zone of towns, villages, forests, and farms that had to be abandoned due to radioactive contamination. Figure 15. 11. However, The Soviet government minimized information about the crisis to reduce its embarrassment and maintain an image of technical dominance. Decades later, we can glimpse what people were thinking and doing at the time. A picture shows the view from the top of a building. There is a metal fence around the edges of the building in the concrete roof, and wires going up from the fence on the right side. The floor of the roof looks dark and littered. The view shows tall and long white buildings and green trees in front of a blue sky. In the background, there is a large group of buildings with tall pipes. Figure 15. 11. The Chernobyl disaster. The accident at the nuclear power plant of Chernobyl in the background led to the abandonment of the city of Pripyat foreground. Credit. Modification of work, view of Chernobyl taken from Pripyat by Jason Minshall / Wikimedia Commons public domain. At that time, my notions of nuclear power stations were utterly idyllic. At school and at the university, we'd been taught that this was a magical factory that made energy out of nothing, where people in white robes sat and pushed buttons. Chernobyl blew up when we weren't prepared. And also there wasn't any information. We got stacks of paper marked top secret. Reports of the accident, secret. Results of medical observations, secret. Reports about the radioactive exposure of personnel involved in the liquidation of the accident, secret, and so on. There were rumors. Someone read in some paper, someone heard, someone said. Some people listened to what was being said in the West. They were the only ones talking about what pills to take and how to take them. But most often the reaction was, our enemies are celebrating, but we still have it better. Zoya Danilovna Bruck, environmental inspector interviewed by Svetlana Alexievich, Voices from Chernobyl, translated by Keith Jessen. At first everyone said, it's a catastrophe, and then everyone said, it's nuclear war. I'd read about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I'd seen documentary footage. It's frightening but understandable. Atomic warfare, the explosion's radius. I could even imagine it. But what happened to us didn't fit into my consciousness. You feel how some completely unseen thing can enter and then destroy the whole world, can crawl in and enter you. I remember a conversation with this scientist. This is for thousands of years, he explained. The decomposition of uranium. That's 238 half-lives. Translated into time, that's 1 billion years. And for thorium, it's 14 billion years. 50, 100, 200, but beyond that my consciousness couldn't go. Anatoly Shimansky, journalist interviewed by Svetlana Alexievich, Voices from Chernobyl, translated by Keith Jessen. Do you think Chernobyl changed the prospects for nuclear energy use? Why or why not? How should governments handle disasters of this magnitude? If your government dealt with this event, how would you want it to do so? It was also in the 1980s that scientists first detected the existence of an ozone hole over Antarctica. The ozone layer is a portion of the Earth's upper atmosphere with especially high concentrations of ozone molecules. Figure 15. 12. It serves to block much of the potentially harmful solar radiation the Earth naturally receives from the Sun, and thus is essential for life on this planet as we know it. The news that this layer had a hole, an area severely depleted by the use of manufactured chemicals in common consumer items like aerosols, refrigerants, and food packaging, startled the public. Some environmentalists predicted an apocalyptic near future in which billions would die of skin cancer caused by the sun, and the Earth's surface would become unlivable. A picture of a piece of a blue-colored planet is shown. There are clouds swirling around the blue and bright spots are scattered throughout the clouds. Above the clouds there is a yellowish haze and then a dark black sky with stars. Figure 15. 12. Earth's ozone layer. The Earth's protective ozone layer is visible as a hazy blue film hanging in the planet's atmosphere in this 2015 photograph from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Credit. View of Earth taken during ISS Expedition 42 by NASA / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In the 1980s and early 1990s, people also became concerned about the plight of the environmentally invaluable Amazon rainforest. The movement known as Save the Rainforest brought professional environmentalists and concerned citizens together to raise awareness about deforestation. Brazil's extensive rainforests had been under threat since the 1960s, when cattle ranchers and others began clearing thousands of acres of pristine forest. Until the 1980s, few people had paid much attention. But concerns rose in wealthy countries about the harm done by major beef producers and other multinational corporations to the people and resources in developing countries, including by eliminating the lungs of the planet, trees that produce oxygen and absorb the carbon dioxide created by industrial processes. And more people began to take notice. Environmentalists stressed the rainforest's unique biodiversity and warned of the consequences of destroying the sole source of potentially world-changing drugs and species of animals found nowhere else on Earth. Anthropologists and indigenous activists spoke of the effect on indigenous peoples who lived and hunted in the rainforest and were threatened with loss of both home and livelihood. These warnings merged with developed countries' anxieties about overconsumption and living beyond their means. The result was the Save the Rainforest campaign. By 1991, the effort had borne fruit, and deforestation in the Amazon had declined to one of the lowest recorded rates. Between 2005 and 2010, Brazil managed to reduce the destruction, but millions of hectares are still being cleared each year. It was also during the late 1980s that much of the world was first introduced to the concept of global warming, the general rise in Earth's temperature that scientists have observed over approximately the last 200 years. The consensus is that this warming is the result of a steady increase in fossil fuel burning since the start of the Industrial Revolution. The process has contributed to a rise in greenhouse gas levels, which trap yet more heat within the Earth's atmosphere. Global warming is just one aspect of climate change, a broader phenomenon that includes changes in temperature, weather, storm activity, wind patterns, sea levels, and other influences on the planet. Both global warming and climate change present enormous challenges for the future. Rising sea levels may make some large coastal cities around the world unlivable. Stronger storms, floods, and more intense heat can make life unbearable in entire regions. Extreme weather events like hurricanes, heat waves, and forest fires caused by drought and high temperatures may kill and injure thousands and cause billions of dollars in property losses. Hotter, wetter conditions may encourage the breeding of insects that spread infectious diseases like malaria and West Nile virus. These changes, in turn, will likely lead to worldwide problems. The World Bank estimates that more than 200 million people could become climate refugees, people forced to flee their homes to find livable climates in other areas, over the next few decades. Linked to learning. Artists have always tried to highlight problems around the world. Climate change is no exception. Take a look at this PBS report on the Ghost Forest exhibit created by artist Maya Lin for one stunning example. Environmentalism today. Many of the most outspoken proponents of environmentalism and policies to curb fossil fuel use have come from the United States and developed countries in Europe. Some of their anxieties about the state of the environment are a product of their own affluence and the sense that it is unsustainable. Yet frequently, their environmental concerns have clashed with the interests of developing countries, which are largely geared toward growth. Concerns about the Amazon rainforest is one example of this dynamic. The depletion of the rainforest was largely the result of the expansion of cattle ranching and later of farming in the Amazon River basin. When rainforest trees are removed for these purposes, the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide, CO2, is released, contributing to global warming. Ranching also contributes to a rise in methane, another greenhouse gas produced by the cattle themselves. While environmentalists in the United States and Europe viewed with horror the increase of greenhouse gases and the loss of animal habitats, plants and trees, the clearing of land brought economic opportunities for many Brazilians. It created jobs for poor workers, produced lumber for construction, and opened space for ranchers to graze cattle and farmers to grow crops that could be consumed domestically or exported for profit. Debates about whether these outcomes are positive or negative reflect the fact that developed countries have mostly freed themselves from concerns about survival. They are able now to focus on sustainability, while developing countries like Brazil must exploit their natural resources to get by and improve their economic position. Between 1990 and 2019, China's coal consumption increased nearly 4 times. Its energy needs have become enormous as China has industrialized, and its citizens have experienced a rising standard of living. While the Chinese are not immune to criticisms about high coal consumption, which emits greenhouse gases and contributes to global warming, their policies suggest their larger concern is maintaining their country's continued growth and development. Groups like Greenpeace, an environmental organization founded in 1971, sometimes express dismay about such perspectives. For example, in the 1970s, Greenpeace and other environmental groups pushed for a ban on seal hunting around the world, calling it unsustainable and cruel to the animals. However, many in Canada and other Arctic regions depend on sealing for their livelihoods. They felt Greenpeace and other environmentalists undermined their industry and hampered their efforts to provide for their families. They resented being portrayed as unfeeling killers by organizations that appeared to know little about their lives. A similar conflict erupted in the forests of the Pacific Northwest in the 1980s, as environmentalists ramped up protests against logging in order to preserve the spotted owl, a threatened species indigenous to states like Washington and Oregon. Figure 15. 13. Threatened species are those the government identifies as likely to soon be endangered. The tens of thousands of loggers who depended on the industry to survive complained that while the environmental concerns were real, their livelihoods should take priority over the survival of an individual species. The conflict became known as the Timber Wars and gained enormous media attention in the late 1980s and early 1990s. In the end, the U.S. government sought a compromise in the Northwest Forest Plan of 1994, which restricted forest exploitation and satisfied neither group. A picture of an owl sitting on the green, mossy branch of a tree is shown. The owl has big black eyes with small yellow pinpoints in the middle, a small, curved, pointy beige beak, and black and brown feathers around its head and brown, white and black feathers on its body. There are leaves, sunlight, and sky in the background. Figure 15. 13. The spotted owl. Concerns about the fate of the spotted owl became a major point of contention between loggers and environmentalists in the Pacific Northwest during the 1990s. Credit: Spotted Owl Forest Bird NPS photo by Olympic National Park /Flickr, public domain. The global response to climate change. Countries from around the world have regularly tried to address environmental problems together. The Montreal Protocol of 1987 was a global agreement to ban and phase out specific chemicals in industrial and consumer products, in the expectation that natural processes would restore the Earth's ozone layer. The accord went into effect almost immediately, and the ozone layer has been steadily recovering ever since. Scientists anticipate that it will be fully healed by 2070, if not earlier. At the United Nations in 1989, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of the United Kingdom gave an urgent warning about the environment and especially climate change. She called for the world to embrace nuclear power as a substitute for coal-burning power plants, but she acknowledged that the increasingly influential Green Party movement remained firmly committed to preventing the proliferation of nuclear technology. Thatcher's speech marked a global acknowledgement that warming and climate change were pressing problems requiring international solutions. Given the success of the Montreal Protocol, she suggested a similar solution to climate change, but it met with resistance from the United States. President Reagan and Thatcher had both risen to power by embracing neoliberal economic policies, which call for market-oriented approaches and a rollback of regulation. Reagan remained largely unmoved even as Dr. James Hansen, an atmospheric scientist working for the U.S. government, testified in Congress that global warming was a real and dangerous threat. Figure 15. 14. A picture is shown of a man sitting at a table in front of two silver microphones with his mouth partially open. There is a stack of papers in front of him. He is wearing a blue suit jacket, white shirt, and red tie. He has brown hair. His right hand is open, and he is holding it above the table, and there is a nameplate in front of the microphones with Dr. Hansen written on it. Behind him, there is a blue wall, and ahead of a man and a woman can be seen as well as another man's shoulders. Figure 15. 14. James Hansen. On June 23, 1988, NASA scientist James Hansen testified to the U.S. Congress about the danger of global warming resulting from the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Credit: James Hansen Crop 1 by NASA/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Despite U.S. resistance, the larger international community proceeded apace. In 1988, the United Nations was able to establish the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Created in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, the UNFCCC convenes annually for negotiations among member countries. Notable meetings have occurred in Kyoto, 1997, Copenhagen, 2009, Paris, 2015, and Edinburgh, 2021. The UNFCCC Paris Agreement of 2015 took into account how much each member country is able to pay for a major transition away from fossil fuels. On a 5-year cycle, the agreement asks each country to make a contribution proportionate to its own needs and its ability to pay for new energy infrastructure, though it has no enforcement mechanism. The goal of the Paris Agreement is total warming of less than 2 degrees C, 3.6 degrees F, above levels from the time of industrialization, around the year 1750. While some have called the agreement successful in helping approach this goal, others feel many countries are not fulfilling the promises they made. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to discuss the development of complex digital computers and their effects on human society, analyze the effects of the internet and social media on society, describe important medical developments of the last 50 years and current medical challenges. World War II brought about a massive technological transformation as countries like Germany and the United States rapidly innovated to avoid destruction and defeat their enemies. In the decades after the war, there was major progress in medical technology, the creation of new vaccines, and the elimination of deadly diseases. All these achievements had profound effects on the way people lived, traveled, and worked. Underlying them were major advancements in the field of information technologies, such as computers. Once the war was over, the development of increasingly powerful computers ushered in a computer revolution as powerful as the 19th century's Industrial Revolution, and with it, a digital age. The digital computer revolution. Many of the technological advancements of the 1940s and 1950s came in the form of increasingly powerful analog computers, which analyze a continuous stream of information, much like that recorded on vinyl records. Analog computers worked well for solving big mathematical problems, such as the calculations related to electrical power delivery systems or the study of nuclear physics. However, one of their weaknesses was that they were inefficient at managing large amounts of data. Digital computers, or those that translate information into a complex series of ones and zeros, were far more capable of managing bulk data. Just a few years after the war, digital computing received a huge boost with the invention of the transistor, a device with far more computing potential than its predecessor, the vacuum tube. Scientists could amplify this enlarged computing capacity even further by wiring multiple transistors together in increasingly complex ways. The use of multiple transistors for computing purposes was an important step, but it had obvious drawbacks. Making machines capable of processing a great deal of information required connecting many transistors, which took up a great deal of space. Then, in the late 1950s, inventors in the United States developed an innovative solution. Using silicon, they could integrate transistors and capacitors in a way that clumsy wiring could not accomplish. The silicon-based integrated circuit freed computer technology from size constraints and opened the door to additional advancements in computing power. Even so, digital computers remained large, expensive, and complicated to operate, and their use was largely confined to universities and the military. Only gradually over the 1970s did computing technology become more widely available, largely thanks to mass-produced general-purpose computers, sometimes called mini-computers, designed by IBM and the Digital Equipment Company. These served a variety of government and private purposes, such as calculating the census, managing the flow of tax monies, and processing calculations related to creditworthiness, figure 1515. But despite being somewhat cheaper, mini-computers remained out of reach for average users. A black and white photo is shown of a woman in a light-colored belted dress with short sleeves sitting at a table with a large machine on it. She has long hair and bangs and is holding a spool of film in her left hand, pulling the film down with her right hand. There are many buttons, knobs, and dials on the machine in front of her, and vents underneath the machine by her knees. In the background, the walls around her hold machinery with knobs, slats, and buttons all in rows on several panels. On the right wall along the top is a sign with film optical sensing device for input to computers, printed in black across it. Long, thin, slatted lights hang from the ceiling. Figure 15. 15 computers, 1950s. In the 1950s, computers required complex data management systems to operate. The U.S. Census Bureau used this device to transfer data from paper questionnaires to microfilm to allow for rapid processing by its computers. Credit: modification of work, woman inspecting FOSDIC film by U.S. Census Bureau/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The journey from mini-computers to personal computers began with the Intel Corporation, established in 1968 in Mountain View, California, in a region now commonly called Silicon Valley. During the 1970s, Intel developed a line of integrated circuits that were not only more powerful than their predecessors, but also programmable. These became known as microprocessors, and they revolutionized computing by holding all of a computer's processing power in a single integrated circuit. In 1975, a company in New Mexico released the first marketed personal computer, the Altair 8800. This used an Intel microprocessor and was promoted to computer hobbyists eager to wield a level of computing power once available to only a few. The Altair's popularity inspired competing products like the Apple, the Commodore, and the Tandy Radio Shack computer, figure 15. 16. These personal computer systems were far easier to use and appealed to a much larger market than just hobbyists. On a wooden desk sits an old computer with a deep monitor and a green screen with words in a basic font, attached to a thick beige keyboard with 2 rows of vents along the top. A beige box sits to the right of the computer with black rectangular slots along the left and a black square item sticking out of the back slot. There are vents along the top right and the word Tandy on the front on a black strip next to red, blue, and green slanted stripes. The next box on the right is rectangular with vents along the back and 2 slots with locks in the front. All 3 machines are connected with wires in the back. A phone is partially shown on the left with round number buttons. Figure 15. 16 Personal computer, 1980s. The Tandy Color Computer 3 shown here, released in 1986 and nicknamed the Coco 3, was one of many personal computers released in the 1980s that average consumers were able to buy for their homes. Credit, Coco 3 system by unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. By 1982, there were 5 million personal computers in the United States, and over the next decade, their number and computing power rose exponentially. Computers proliferated in government offices, private firms, and family homes. Then, in 1984, Apple introduced the world to the Macintosh computer, which not only used a mouse, but also replaced the standard code-based user interface with one based on graphics and icons. Recognizing the user-friendly possibilities of this graphic interface, competitors followed suit. Before long, the design popularized by Apple had become the norm. By the end of the 1980s, not only had personal computers become common, but the microprocessor itself could be found everywhere. Microprocessors were incorporated into automobiles, cash registers, televisions, and household appliances, and made possible a variety of other electronic devices like video cassette recorders and video game systems. Figure 15. 17. Computer systems were created to store and manage financial, educational, and healthcare information. In one form or another, and whether they realized it or not, by the 1990s, almost everyone in the developed world was interacting with computers. A picture is shown of a black rectangular item with a brown wooden front. There are long grooves along the front on top, and a raised area along the back with switches, 2 on each side and a slot in the middle. The switches on the left are labeled Power in red and TV Type in yellow. Color and BW are indicated at the top and bottom of the TV Type switch. The switches on the right are labeled Game Select and Game Reset in yellow with yellow arrows pointing down on the right sides of the switches. The words Video Computer System TM are written in white above the middle slot. A black square with a tall black joystick handle sits on the top left corner. It has a red button in the left corner and is connected to the console with a wire. The word Atari Registered is written in white on the bottom front of the brown panel with a symbol of one line and a curved line on either side printed above it. Figure 15. 17. The Atari Video Computer System, 1977. Released in 1977, the Atari Video Computer System could be connected to almost any television, allowing users to play video games at home. The software was stored on small plastic cartridges that were plugged directly into the machine. Credit: Atari 2600 MIT Joystick by Joho 345/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Modems were hardly new in the 1990s, but they became much faster and more common with the rise of the Internet. The origins of the Internet date back to the 1960s and the efforts by government researchers in the United States to use computers to share information. These developments were especially important for the U.S. Department of Defense during the Cold War and resulted in the emergence of the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, ARPANET. In creating ARPANET, researchers developed many of the technologies that over the next few decades formed the basis for the Internet we know today. The Internet and social media. The process of globalization has been accelerated by the rise of the Internet and the various social media platforms like Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter that exist there. Many people were introduced to the potential of computer networks for sharing information and creating small social networks in the 1980s, when individual users became able to connect their computers to others by using modems and telephone networks. This connectivity gave rise to regional bulletin board systems, BBSs, in which one person's computer served as a host for those of other users, figure 15. 18. BBSs functioned much like websites today. Though they ran far more slowly and had limited capabilities, they allowed users to share computer files like games and images, post messages for others to read, participate in virtual discussions and debates, and play text-based online games. BBSs used phone networks to communicate, and long-distance calls were then expensive, so their users tended to be local. An image of a black computer screen with words and numbers typed in white, blue, green, and pink all over is shown. Across the top in a gray bar are three circles on the left, the words Arch Linux 32 in the middle, and an oval rectangle on the right. Across the bottom in a gray bar are the words to direct input to this virtual machine. Click inside the window. Are printed. On the bottom right are 10 icons. A picture of a camera, a gray box with a line branching off in three parts, a rectangle with a dark rectangle on the bottom, a line with two lines in a V shape on the left and two triangles on the right, a black circle with many other circles inside and two white dots on either side, a rectangle with a white circle at the top, three squares with on the left and on the right of those squares, a speaker with round circles coming out on the right, and a box with two people walking toward each other in it. At the bottom right are three lines drawn across the corner. Figure 15. 18. A bulletin board system, 1980s. Bulletin board systems like this one relied on colorful text and simple graphics to make them appealing. They appear very limited compared to today's websites, but in the 1980s, they were revolutionary and opened new possibilities for the future of communication. Credit. Screenshot of OpenTG's Group Permissions Editor by Chris Tusa / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Throughout the 1980s, BBSs continued to be popular with computer hobbyists and those intrigued by the idea of unique virtual communities, while networking technology improved steadily behind the scenes. The United States, Europe, and other developed countries were busy adopting a uniform protocol system that would allow computers around the world to easily communicate with others. Once this protocol had been established, the commercial internet as we currently understand it was born. As early as 1987, about 30,000 hosts resided on the burgeoning internet. Soon telecommunications and software companies began to exploit this new network by creating online service providers like America Online, AOL, to act as gateways to the internet. Initially, they used standard phone lines and modems to connect, much as BBSs had. But as the volume of information on the internet increased exponentially, service providers turned to more expensive broadband connections that used cable television lines and even dedicated lines to connect. During the 1990s, the first websites, the first internet search engines, and the first commercial internet platforms were established. By 2005, more than 1 billion people worldwide were using the internet regularly. They were able to shop online, make phone calls around the world, and even create their own websites with almost no technical training. Never before had the world been so connected. In 2004, Facebook was launched. Originally a networking tool for Harvard students, it quickly expanded globally to become a giant in the new world of social media. By 2010, nearly 500 million Facebook users around the world were sharing images and messages, creating communities, and linking to news stories. By 2022, the number of Facebook users had reached nearly 3 billion. Before 2007, almost all internet users gained access to the network via a personal computer, either at home or at work. That year, however, Apple Inc. released the first iPhone, a powerful cell phone but also a portable computer capable of performing all the tasks it once required a desktop computer to do. Even more revolutionary, it connected to the internet wirelessly through cell phone infrastructure. While the iPhone was not the first phone to connect to the internet, Its revolutionary touchscreen interface was far superior to earlier systems. Within just a few years, other cell phone manufacturers were imitating its design and putting smartphones, and thus internet access, in the pockets of users around the world. Smartphones have transformed life in developing countries, where they have helped bypass some of the traditional stages of infrastructure creation. In Africa, for example, people living where no landlines existed can now communicate with others using cell phones. Small farmers and traders can use cell phones for banking and to connect with potential suppliers and customers. In communities without libraries, school children can access the internet's resources to study. Smartphones have also democratized the internet, serving as powerful tools for organizing and promoting political change. The large pro-democracy movement in Cairo's Tahrir Square captured the world's attention in 2011, for example. But it began with 25-year-old activist Asma Mahfouz's YouTube video of January 18, 2011, in which she spoke directly to the camera and urged young Egyptians to protest at the square as part of the larger Arab Spring, a call for government reform and democracy that echoed across in the Arab world. The Arab Spring was touched off in December 2010 when Mohamed Bouazizi, a young college graduate, set himself on fire in Tunisia after government officials there tried to interfere with the fruit cart that was his only source of income. Other young Tunisians took to the streets in protest, and demonstrations began again in January 2011. As people died in confrontations with government forces, President Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali fled the country, and Tunisia's prime minister resigned shortly thereafter. The Tunisian protests led to similar demonstrations in Egypt. On January 17, 2011, an Egyptian set himself on fire near the nation's parliament to protest the lack of economic opportunities. Crowds of mostly young people responded with massive demonstrations that lasted weeks, figure 15. 19. These demonstrations were fueled by and broadcast to the world through text messages, photos, tweets, videos, and Facebook posts sent by thousands of mobile phones, including that of Mahfouz. The devices amplified the calls for democracy and showed the world the Egyptian government's use of violence to try to silence the protesters. Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak resigned on February 11, 2011. He was later convicted for his role in ordering government forces to harm and kill protesters. A picture and an image are shown. A picture shows a large circular area in the middle of a large crowd of people filling every space. Inside the circular area are many white tents with people underneath. Banners surround the circular area with Egyptian writing. In front of the circular area, there are 6 rows of people kneeling on the ground with their heads down. Another large tented circular area is shown behind the first area. In the background, tall buildings and the sky can be seen. A map of northern Africa and some of the Middle East is shown. Egypt and Yemen are highlighted purple to indicate government overthrown multiple times. Tunisia is highlighted green to indicate government overthrown. Libya and Syria are highlighted beige to indicate civil war. Morocco, Western Sahara, Oman, Jordan, and Kuwait are highlighted pink to indicate protests and governmental changes. Algeria, Sudan, and Iraq are highlighted yellow to indicate major protests. Mauritania, Somalia, and Saudi Arabia are highlighted orange to indicate minor protests. Mali, Nigeria, Chad, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Gabon, Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan are highlighted blue to indicate other protests and militant action outside the Arab world. All other parts of the map are gray and the water is white. There is a thick, dark green circle drawn on the map on the eastern shore of Saudi Arabia. Figure 15. 19. The Egyptian Revolution. Internet-connected cell phones using social media applications like Facebook were a common sight at the large 2011 protests at Tahrir Square, Cairo. B. The map shows the results of other uprisings in Africa and the Middle East that were part of the Arab Spring of 2010-2012. Credit, a modification of work Tahrir Square during 8 February 2011 by Mona/Flickr, CC by 2. 0. Credit B. Modification of work Arab Spring and Regional Conflict Map by Ian Rimsen/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In the wake of the Egyptian protests, activists in Libya, Yemen, Syria, Morocco, Lebanon, Jordan, and other countries coordinated their activities using computers and smartphones to access social media, video, and mobile phone messaging. These efforts resulted in protests, changes to the laws, and even the toppling of governments, such as in Egypt and Tunisia. They also led to civil war in Syria, Iraq, and Libya, leading to thousands of deaths and a refugee crisis in the Mediterranean. While Twitter and Facebook were useful for scaling up protests, the movements to which they gave birth often struggled to find a purpose in countries without a well-established resistance movement. Link to learning. In this interview, Egyptian-American journalist and pro-democracy activist Mona Eltahoy talks about the Arab Spring and Revolution in Egypt and the use of social media as a tool for organizing. She addresses the role of social media in 2 parts. Take a look at her answers to "Did the government completely misjudge what they were doing?" and "Could this have happened without social media, without these new technologies?" Since 2011, governments around the world have come to recognize the power of social media to bring about change, and many authoritarian and even ostensibly democratic leaders have moved to limit or block social media use in their countries. China has blocked Facebook and Twitter since 2009 and encourages its citizens to instead use the state-authorized app WeChat, which shares information with the government. In 2020, India banned the social media app TikTok, claiming it threatened state security and public order. In March 2022, following its February invasion of Ukraine, Russia banned Instagram and Facebook because, the government alleged, the platforms carried messages calling for violence against Russian troops and against Russian President Vladimir Putin. Turkmenistan has gone further than China, India, or Russia. It not only bans Facebook and Twitter, but it also requires citizens applying for internet access to swear they will not try to evade state censorship. Link to learning. China is noted for its strict internet censorship, and its government blocks access to a large number of sites in a policy colloquially known as the Great Firewall of China. The Comparitech service allows you to see websites blocked in China by entering and searching them. In the United States, lawmakers have recognized that social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter can both promote and endanger democracy. Social media provides extremist groups with the ability to attract followers from across the nation and incite violence. Groups can use the platforms to spread fake news, and a report by the U.S. Senate has concluded that Russian intelligence operatives used Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to manipulate voters. Legislators have called on social media to more actively censor the content on their platforms and limit or block access by groups or persons spreading hate speech or disinformation. The potential for misuse of technology is heightened by advances that enable the creation of deepfakes, computer-generated images that closely resemble real people, medical miracles, and ongoing health challenges. Advances in computer technology were not the only technological success stories of the post-World War II world. In 1947, scientists perfected an artificial kidney, and just 5 years later, the first successful kidney transplant was performed. In the 1950s, antipsychotic drugs were developed and used to treat neurological disorders that once consigned patients to a lifetime of difficult treatment in a psychiatric hospital. In the 1950s, geneticists discovered the double helix structure of DNA, information that was crucial for later advancements, such as the ability to use DNA to diagnose and treat genetic diseases. In 1962, a surgical team successfully reattached a severed limb for the first time, and in 1967, the first human heart transplant took place. Over the next decade and a half, medical advances made it possible to conduct telemedicine, view and monitor internal organs without performing surgery, and monitor the heartbeat of a fetus during pregnancy. Medical science also made enormous gains in eradicating diseases that had been common for centuries. For example, polio had caused paralysis and even death since the late 19th century. But in 1950, the first successful polio vaccine, developed by the Polish-born virologist Hilary Kaprowski, was demonstrated as effective in children. This was an orally ingested live vaccine, a weakened form of the virus designed to help the immune system develop antibodies. In the meantime, researcher Jonas Salk at the University of Pittsburgh was developing an injectable dead virus vaccine, Figure 15.20. This vaccine rendered the virus inactive but still triggered the body to produce antibodies. In 1955, Salk's vaccine was licensed for use in the United States, and mass distribution began there. Other vaccines were developed in the United States and other countries over the next several years. Their use has nearly eradicated polio cases, which once numbered in the hundreds of thousands. When polio was detected in an adult in New York in July 2022, it was the first case in the United States since 2013. A black and white photo of a serious-looking man is shown. He has dark hair, a large, balding forehead, and wears a suit, white-collared shirt, tie, and glasses. He is standing in front of the tail of a SAS airplane. Other small airplanes can be seen in the far background. Figure 15.20. Jonas Salk. After the polio vaccine he developed proved successful, Dr. Jonas Salk chose not to patent it to ensure it would be used freely around the world. Credit: Dr. Jonas Edward Salk, creator of Salk polio vaccine, at Copenhagen Airport, by SAS Scandinavian Airlines /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The eradication of smallpox is another important success story. Centuries ago, smallpox devastated communities around the world, especially Native American groups, which had no immunity to the disease when Europeans brought it to their shores. Early vaccines based on the cowpox virus were deployed in the United States and Europe in the 18th century with great effect. In the 20th century, advancements made the vaccine safer and easier to administer. However, by the 1950s, much of the world remained unvaccinated and susceptible. Beginning in 1959, the World Health Organization, WHO, began working to eradicate smallpox through mass vaccination, redoubling efforts in 1967 through its intensified eradication program. During the 1970s, smallpox was eradicated in South America, Asia, and Africa. In 1980, the WHO declared it had been eliminated globally. The WHO's smallpox program is considered the most effective disease eradication initiative in history, but it was an aggressive campaign not easily replicated. And without a vaccine, the problems of controlling transmissible diseases can be immense. A novel disease was first reported among Los Angeles gay community in 1981, and by 1982, it had become known as AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Researchers realized it was commonly transmitted through sexual intercourse, but could also be passed by shared needles and blood transfusions. At that time, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control explained that AIDS was not transmitted through casual contact, but the information did little to calm rising concerns about this still largely mysterious and deadly disease. By 1987, more than 60,000 people in the world had died of AIDS. In the United States, the government was slow to fund research to develop treatments or to find a cure. That year, activists at the Lesbian and Gay Community Services Center in New York City, concerned with the toll that AIDS was taking on the gay community, and the government's seeming lack of concern, regarding a disease that the media depicted as affecting primarily gay men, an already stigmatized group, formed the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP. ACT UP engaged in nonviolent protest to bring attention to their cause and worked to correct misinformation regarding the disease and those who were infected with it. By the year 2000, scientists in the developed world had acquired a sophisticated understanding of AIDS and the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, and treatments have emerged that make it a manageable rather than a lethal disease, at least in the developed world. But in parts of the developing world, like sub-Saharan Africa, infection rates were still rising. One difficulty was that HIV infection and AIDS had become associated with homosexuality, which carried stigma, and in some places, even legal penalties that made those infected reluctant to seek help. Addressing transmission with the general public also meant broaching sometimes culturally sensitive topics like sexual intercourse. Those attempting to control the spread of the disease often found themselves trying to influence social and cultural practices, a complicated task fraught with pitfalls. This does not mean there were not successes. The proliferation of condom use, circumcision, and public information campaigns, along with the declining cost of treatment, have greatly reduced the extent of the epidemic in Africa. But AIDS is still an enormous and devastating reality for Africans today. Sub-Saharan Africa is home to nearly 70% of the world's HIV-positive cases. Women and children are particularly affected. Africa accounts for 92% of all cases of infected pregnant women and 90% of all infected children. Ebola virus has also threatened the health of Africans. The first known outbreak of Ebola, a hemorrhagic fever, took place in Central Africa in 1976. Since then, there have been several other outbreaks. In 2013-2016, an outbreak in West Africa quickly spread across national borders and threatened to become a global epidemic. Approximately 10,000 people fell ill in Liberia alone, and nearly half of those infected died. The most recent challenge to world health, the COVID-19 pandemic, demonstrates the effects of both globalization and technological developments. The coronavirus SARS-CoV-2 appeared in Wuhan, China, an industrial and commercial hub, in December 2019. Airplane and cruise ship passengers soon unwittingly spread it throughout the world. The first confirmed case in the United States appeared in January 2020. As every continent reported infections, offices, stores, and schools closed, and travel bans appeared. Despite these restrictions, middle-class and wealthy people in the developed world continued almost as normal. Many worked, studied, shopped, visited friends and family, and consulted doctors online from their homes. Low-paid workers in service industries often lost their jobs, however, as restaurants and hotels closed, and children without access to computers or stable internet connections struggled to keep up with their classes. Even the more fortunate in the developed world confronted shortages of goods from toilet paper to medicines to infant formula when global supply chains stalled as farm laborers, factory workers, dock hands, and railroad employees fell ill or workplaces closed to prevent the spread of infection. Developing countries lacked funds to support their citizens through prolonged periods of unemployment. Although vaccines were developed in several countries, they were available primarily to people in wealthier nations. As of March 2022, only 1% of all vaccine doses administered worldwide had been given to people in low-income countries. Beyond the book, public art in modern pandemics, dangerous diseases like HIV/AIDS can energize more people than doctors working in laboratories and global leaders publishing reports. During the early years of the HIV/AIDS crisis, grassroots organizers from around the world strove to focus attention on the problem. Their actions were necessary because governments often did little to prevent the spread of the disease or provide treatment for those infected. The AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT-UP, became known for staging loud protests in public and sometimes private places to raise awareness about the disease. In the United States, the publicity generated through groups like ACT-UP forced the government to pay greater attention and to budget more money to the search for a cure. Some artists responded to this movement with murals in well-known locations like the Berlin Wall, Figure 15. 21. A picture of 3 sections of a concrete wall is shown. A mural of an open mouth is drawn on the larger middle section. It has red lips, a red painted inside, and teeth, white on top and red at the bottom. The words "Act Up" are painted inside the mouth, "Act" in white and "Up" in tan. The side sections of the well have dark scribblings on them. Figure 15. 21. AIDS mural. Artists often use the western face of the Berlin Wall to create provocative murals. This one, painted in the 1980s, featured the name of the HIV/AIDS awareness group ACT-UP. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. Credit: Act Up. From the West Side of the Berlin Wall by Rory Finneran/Flickr, CC by 20. While some murals about diseases were a call to action, especially about HIV/AIDS, others have aimed to educate the public. A mural painted on a wall in Kenya for World Malaria Day 2014 showed viewers the proper use of bed nets to help lower the rate of infection. Figure 15. 22. A mural is on a wall is shown. A large oval is shown in the middle with a wooden double bed. In the bed, there is a woman in a green nightgown and black hair, and a small child with darker hair under a pink blanket and on white pillows. There is a blue, tall net draped around the bed, and mosquitoes are seen flying all around the net. On the floor to the right of the bed is a man with short dark hair and blue pants laying on a pink mat with shoes next to his mat. The background of the oval is green at the bottom and turns to blue at the top. At the top of the blue net, there is a white oval with blue trim with a drawing of a long, dark coiled bug with a tail at the end labeled larva. There is a red arrow pointing to the right. The word cycle is written to the right of the oval with a red arrow pointing to another white circle with blue trim on the right side of the oval on the mural. It shows a dark coiled bug with a large black and white head with an eye and is labeled pupa. A red arrow is pointing to the bottom of the mural oval. The word malaria is written in black and red around the blue trimmed circle. At the bottom of the mural, a blue-trimmed white circle shows a mosquito on an orange and white background with the word adult written inside. Between the bottom blue-trimmed circle and the one on the right side of the oval are the words Kila Yuzuku, Kila Msimu, written along the oval in black. On the left side of the oval there is a blue-trimmed white circle with 23 black dots, and the word eggs written in red above the dots and a red arrow pointing to the top of the oval. The words Lala Ndani Yaneti Iliadabiwa are written along the oval from the circle with the eggs down to the mosquito circle. Above the eggs circle is the word Zuya in black and red, and then the word malaria running along the oval toward the top larva circle. Along the top of the oval, there are 4 pictures of a hollow X. Figure 15. 22 Malaria mural. This 2014 mural in Kenya illustrates how to avoid malaria infection with mosquito nets. The caption reads, "Sleep in a treated net every night every season." Credit: Final mural at Nangina Primary School, Busia County, by U.S. President's Malaria Initiative/Flickr, public domain. During the COVID-19 pandemic, artists also went to the streets. Some of the murals they painted demanded action or celebrated health workers. Others called for awareness about the rising number of elderly people dying of the disease. Figure 1523. A large wall mural is shown behind some short bushes with trees in the background on both sides. The top and bottom of the mural has wavy lines, and the concrete is shown above and below it. At the bottom left, a small black tree is shown with the words Rick Rioja's Art and Soul Agency in white above. Next to the tree, The shadow of the back of an elderly man walking with a cane is shown with him holding hands with a small girl in a dress. Above them is a large gray wrinkled hand with a small smooth gray hand grasping three of its fingers. The words "Familia ist alles" are written in cursive in black, orange, gray, and white to the right of the gray hands. Below the words, a row of large many-storied buildings are shown fading into the background. Above the words, a white and gray dove flies with an olive branch in its mouth. At the left of the mural, a girl is in front of a window with long dark hair, a white and gray shimmery bow in her hair, wearing a short-sleeved shirt and looking sad. A black heart outline is shown in the bottom right corner on the wall, and the words #Dehem Bleu are written along the bottom of the mural in orange. Figure 15. 23 COVID-19 mural. In this German mural about the COVID-19 pandemic, the artist shows how the highly communicable disease separated generations while also highlights the vulnerability of the elderly. The caption reads, "Family is everything." Credit: Mural Family ist Alles by Rick Riojas, 2020 by Hubert Berberich / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. What makes art a powerful medium for conveying messages about awareness? What aspects of these murals seem especially powerful to you? Do you recall seeing artwork from the COVID-19 pandemic or any other disease outbreak? What stood out in it? What other art forms might an artist use to communicate political or social messages? How are these methods effective? Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe threats to global peace and security since the end of the Cold War. Identify some consequences of migration and refugee resettlement in Europe and the United States. Identify recent and current threats to human rights around the world. Analyze the effects on poorer nations of the increasing division between the global North and the global South. On February 24, 2022, the world watched in horror and frustration as Russian tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border and began bombing cities around the former Soviet Republic. This was the second time in fewer than 10 years that Russian troops had invaded the nation. In 2014, Russian forces had annexed the Ukrainian region of Crimea. While both invasions were decades in the making, to many they seemed like a rerun of a bygone era. Those who had watched Soviet tanks roll into Budapest and Prague to quell uprisings in the 1950s and 1960s saw the invasion of 2014 and the violence of 2022 as a reminder that some problems, no matter how far in the past, remain unresolved. Instability in the post-Cold War world. When the Soviet Union dissolved on December 31, 1991, most in the West celebrated the end of the Cold War, believing that a new world that would uniformly embrace liberal democracy and capitalism was in the process of being born. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama even published a book on the idea in 1992 called The End of History and the Last Man. The argument presented in the book was that the world had been marching toward a Western liberal democratic future for centuries, and with the Soviet Union gone, it had reached the inevitable end of its ideological evolution. With the United States as the only remaining superpower, many also assumed the Cold War's bipolar world would soon evolve into a mostly unipolar one based on U.S. military, cultural, and economic dominance. With this idea in mind, U.S. President Bill Clinton drafted a foreign policy platform geared to revising and expanding the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the alliance for mutual defense forged by the United States and other Western democracies during the Cold War. Clinton aimed to strengthen relationships in Asia, bring post-Soviet Russia into the international community, and address ethnic and political strife in the Middle East, the Balkans, Northern Ireland, Latin America, and East Africa. These goals occasionally required using the country's military, such as in 1995, when Clinton sent a force of 20,000 to the Balkans, as part of a NATO operation to enforce a ceasefire and protect upcoming elections. One of the most pressing concerns for the United States and the world, however, was the need to secure the 35,000 nuclear weapons, then installed in thousands of sites around Eurasia. Many were in states that had separated from the former Soviet Union, such as Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. Because these countries were going through a difficult period of transition and instability, many feared that non-state actors, meaning terrorist groups not tied to a specific country, might gain access to the armaments or the material necessary to make them and cause catastrophic damage. Some of the work had begun even before the Soviet Union collapsed. In the summer of 1991, the United States and the Soviet Union had signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START, agreeing to each reduce their arms stockpiles by more than 80%. After the disintegration of the USSR, however, the need to secure these stockpiles became more pressing. The solution proposed by the United States and supported by Russia was to denuclearize those states that had split from the former Soviet Union but still possessed nuclear weapons. While successful, the effort did run into some difficulties, particularly in Ukraine, which felt that preserving its nuclear weapons would be the best way to deter Russian belligerence in the future. Only after it had secured assurances from the international community that its borders would be respected did Ukraine allow its nuclear weapons to be removed and disassembled in Russia. Nuclear proliferation elsewhere around the world was also a problem. India, for example, had become a nuclear power in 1974. At the time, it claimed it was not pursuing nuclear weapons capability, but since then, it has embraced these weapons as an important part of its security platform. Given the history of hostility between India and Pakistan, international observers in the 1970s worried about the implications of a nuclear-armed India. Some of these fears were realized in 1998 when Pakistan tested its first nuclear weapons, a goal toward which it had been building since before India became a nuclear power. While India maintains a no-first-use doctrine for its nuclear weapons, Pakistan has not reciprocated. Today, the countries have approximately 100 nuclear weapons each, as well as long-range ballistic missile delivery systems. Only a few years after Pakistan tested its first nuclear weapon, the illusion of an enduring post-Cold War peace was further shaken when on September 11, 2001, 19 militant Islamic hijackers took control of 4 large passenger airplanes and crashed 2 of them into New York City's World Trade Center, Figure 15. 24, 1 into the Pentagon and the 4th, after its path was deflected by passengers, into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. It was soon determined that the terrorist attack, which killed nearly 3,000 people from many nations, had been orchestrated by Al-Qaeda, an Islamic terrorist organization then based in Afghanistan that was financed and led by a militant Saudi Arabian national named Osama bin Laden. According to bin Laden, the attack was carried out in response to U.S. support for Israel and its continued military presence in the Middle East. A picture of a crumbled building is shown. Firemen and other people in hard hats are walking amid the twisted and burnt rubble, moving objects and picking things up. 2 tall gridded walls are seen on the left side, and in the back bent against the rubble on the ground. A large red crane is shown at the right, and the American flag with red and white stripes and white stars on a blue background in the left corner is shown flying in the left side of the picture next to buckets strewn about. Figure 15. 24 September 11, 2001. Less than 2 hours after hijackers flew 2 jetliners into the World Trade Center in New York, both its towers crumbled to the ground in a pile of rubble. Those still inside were all killed. Credit. New York, NY, September 19, 2001. Rescue workers climb over and dig through piles of rubble from the destroyed World Trade Center as the American flag billows over the debris. By Andrea Bucher / Wikimedia Commons. Public domain. After assessing the damage and collecting global support, the United States launched an attack on Afghanistan with the stated purpose of finding those responsible. This offensive represented the beginning of the U.S. war on terror and resulted in the collapse of Afghanistan's Islamic fundamentalist Taliban government, many of whose officials fled to the southern parts of the country or into neighboring Pakistan. Most of al-Qaeda's leadership also escaped, however, including Osama bin Laden. Over the next several years, the U.S. military pursued a policy of eliminating al-Qaeda, rebuilding civil society and infrastructure in Afghanistan, and propping up a democratically elected regime in the country. These efforts were made more difficult, however, by the decision of President George W. Bush to launch a war against Iraq in 2003. The United States supported Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, 1980–1988, but came into conflict with it during the Gulf War in 1990, when Iraq invaded its neighbor Kuwait. The United States, Great Britain, and 33 other nations came to Kuwait's defense by bombing Iraqi targets and then launching a ground invasion. A mere 100 hours after the coalition's ground invasion began, Iraqi forces had retreated from Kuwait, and a ceasefire was in place. Immediately following, uprisings took place in Kurdish and Shiite regions of Iraq that sought to topple President Saddam Hussein's government. Hussein brutally crushed the attempted revolts, but the coalition forces withdrew from Iraq, leaving him in power. In 2001, in the aftermath of the September 11 terrorist attacks, U.S. foreign policy leaders began to worry that Hussein might acquire weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, possibly including biological weapons. The Bush administration wanted to prevent this, and to channel the international goodwill showered on the country after the 2001 attacks toward the goal of removing the Iraqi leader. To this end, the United States built a new coalition of Asian, European, and Latin American countries. It sent Secretary of State Colin Powell to the United Nations to present the argument that Iraq had connections to al-Qaeda and possessed WMDs that made it a threat to international security. Figure 15. 25. Even though at the time some in the U.S. intelligence community felt the evidence on which Powell relied was weak or flawed to secure support for a U.S. invasion, members of the Bush administration such as Vice President Dick Cheney claimed the WMDs existed. A picture of a man sitting in a blue and white striped chair in front of a small black microphone is shown. He wears a dark pin-striped suit coat, white shirt, maroon striped tie, and wears an American flag pin in his left lapel. He has black and white wavy hair, wears glasses, and is shown looking at a white vial in his right hand. Behind him, portions of two men in suits can be seen. Figure 15. 25. Colin Powell. Secretary of State Colin Powell gave a powerful presentation about Iraq's suspected weapons of mass destruction at the United Nations in 2003. At one point, he held up a model vial of anthrax, a bacterium that causes a serious infectious disease, to highlight the danger of biological weapons that Saddam Hussein was supposed to have. Credit: Colin Powell Anthrax Vial. 5 Feb 2003 at the UN. By United States Government /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The invasion began on March 19, 2003, just a few weeks after Powell's presentation. By 2005, it had become obvious to the world that Iraq did not possess WMDs, and the hypothetical al-Qaeda connection had not been demonstrated. The invasion contributed to the violent unraveling of Iraqi society, however, which the coalition forces then struggled for years to bring under control. There were countless civilian casualties. Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs estimates that between 184,382 and 207,156 civilians were killed. While the United States could point to some successes, such as the 2005 Iraq elections and the 2006 conviction of Saddam Hussein for crimes against humanity. The nation's reputation as a global force capable of projecting power to bring about positive change in the world had suffered greatly. The consequences for the United States became more obvious in October 2006, when Communist North Korea launched its first nuclear weapons test, an event the U.S. government had worked for years to prevent. The test was the culmination of decades of work inside the isolated country. North Korean leaders believed nuclear weapons would guarantee its survival in the post-Cold War world. But the United States and neighboring countries like South Korea and Japan worried that the unstable North Korean regime might use the weapons against them. Given the problems in Iraq and diminished global standing of the United States, it was unclear whether North Korea could be deterred from attempting additional tests, or whether the United States could discourage Iran from pursuing a nuclear weapons program. Radicalism, refugees, and resistance. In 2011, the withdrawal of U.S. combat troops from Iraq was completed, 8 long years after the invasion. Hopes that peace in Iraq would last were dashed, however, with the rise of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant ISIL, a fundamentalist and militant Islamic group also referred to as the Islamic State. Formed in 1999, ISIL had fought against the U.S.-led coalition that invaded Iraq in 2003. In 2014, it attacked Iraqi security forces and drove them from a number of cities, including Ramadi, Fallujah, and Mosul, and it killed thousands of members of the Yazidi minority group in Iraq's Sinjar district. ISIL leaders proclaimed themselves the heads of a new caliphate, an Islamic state led by a ruler claiming to be a successor to Muhammad, with religious and political authority over all Muslims. This is a claim most of the world's Muslims reject. In response, a military coalition led by the United States returned to Iraq following a request by the Iraqi government. Meanwhile, ISIL's counterpart in Syria, known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, waged war against both the government of Syria and other non-fundamentalist groups that were also seeking to oust Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. The U.S.-led coalition that returned to Iraq to fight the Islamic State there intervened in Syria as well. Instability in Iraq and Syria led to a flood of refugees making their way across the Mediterranean to Europe in 2015. Figure 15. 26. Yet more were fleeing genocidal violence in the Darfur region of Sudan, while many others sought to escape failing states and poverty in numerous parts of the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. These refugees and economic migrants felt they would find a better and safer life in the developed countries of the West, particularly Germany, Sweden, Britain, France, and the United States, and many were willing to risk their lives to achieve this. A picture is shown of boats in very calm blue water. At the left is a metal rail above a tall silver ship hull. 3 people wearing orange life jackets can be seen climbing a rope ladder from a flat, plain boat next to the ship. 2 people wearing black life jackets over white hazmat suits are at the bottom of the rope ladder. 4 gray buoys are wedged between the ship and the boat, tied to the large ship. The plain, flat boat is completely filled with people. The people inside are dark-skinned with dark hair, all wear various orange life jackets and sit crowded together. A person in a green helmet and blue-black wetsuit stands on the edge of the crowded boat holding on to the buoy rope. To the right of the boat there is a white and gray rigid inflatable boat rib. A boat with a rigid hull and inflatable sides, with 2 people in white hazmat suits and black life jackets, one at the front of the boat and one driving in the back. Another rib boat with the words Naval Service at the front can be seen in the distance with 2 hazmat-clad people toward the back. Figure 15. 26 Refugee Crisis. In 2015, Europeans watched in amazement and sometimes fear as large numbers of refugees in small boats made their way across the Mediterranean from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa to Europe's shores. Credit. Le Ethan Operation Triton by Ogleg na Heiren/Flickr, CC by 20. Upon arrival, these groups met various responses. While some argued that the refugees had survived trauma and deserved to be welcomed with open arms, others said they were fleeing circumstances outside the host country's responsibility and would bring too many cultural and religious changes. For example, many Europeans feared that refugees from Islamic countries would reject the values of the largely secular European nations in which they settled. Many others believe that Muslims embrace political extremism or support acts of terrorism. Responding to the developing migrant crisis, German Chancellor Angela Merkel declared, "We can do this," and promised Germany would welcome 800,000 refugees in 2015. Link to learning. To better understand the motivations and experiences of the refugees who arrived in Europe during the 2015 refugee crisis, the trailer for Human Flow can be viewed. Human Flow is a 2017 film about the crisis directed by the renowned Chinese visual artist and activist Ai Weiwei. While some were heartened by Merkel's offer, others throughout Europe felt it was short-sighted. They noted that since Germany was in the European Union, bringing refugees there effectively amounted to bringing them into any other country in the EU. Within Germany itself, there was also resistance. Founded in 2014, the German group Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West, Pegida, began conducting weekly marches in cities like Dresden, declaring that opening the doors to the Islamic world would spell the end of Europe, figure 15. 27. While Pegida made a point not to categorically oppose refugees, members continue to openly oppose the presence of the Islamic religion and culture within Germany. A picture of a large group of men and women walking on a wet street is shown. They wear pants, jackets, shoes, and hats. 4 have umbrellas. 4 people at the front of the group hold a large banner that is black, red, and yellow striped. The words Burgerbundes Haveland are written in white in the top black strip. Gewalt frei, unabhängig Partelos are written in the middle red stripe in white, and in black on the bottom yellow stripe are the words Wir sind ein Volk, in the middle with Burgerbundes Haveland in smaller black letters on both sides. A white F in a blue box is also seen at the right. Behind the banner, 4 people carry large flags. 2 flags are black, red, and yellow striped, while one is white with some red, and one is yellow with the words Islam and Neen seen, with the rest obscured. In front of the banner, 12 people are standing and walking about, some with umbrellas, some hugging, some talking. In the background of the picture, there is an opaque gate on the curb with grass behind and 6 people standing, watching, and walking. Parts of a white building can be seen behind the people. Figure 15. 27 Immigration protest. Pegida is just one of many European groups that have grown by focusing on European fears about Muslim immigrants and Islamic terrorism. This demonstration by the group took place in Dresden, Germany in 2016. Credit: Pegida Demonstration Dresden 2016 1003 by Crystal Color /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Pegida is just one of several ultranationalist movements that support an extreme form of nationalism and often seek to create ethnically homogeneous homelands. Others are Golden Dawn in Greece, the English Defence League in Britain, and the Identitarian Movement of Austria. Such groups advocate the establishment of ethnic-based citizenship, resist non-European immigration, and generally promote more conservative social policies. Europe is not the only continent to see a resurgence of xenophobic political activism in the last few decades. In Japan, Nippon Kaigi, Japan Conference, is an ultranationalist organization founded in 1997 that advocates a staunchly nationalist education system, a strong monarchy, and positive interpretation of Japan's imperial past. The Nationalist Front of Mexico was founded in 2006 and advocates a neo-fascist ideology and a retreat from globalization. In the United States, The American Freedom Party, American Identity Movement, Patriot Front, National Justice Party, and others promote similar ideas. These groups are especially concerned with preventing immigration to the United States from Latin America, Figure 15. 28. They are generally in the neo-fascist mold and advocate a United States that is overwhelmingly white and European in culture. A picture shows a man in a green shirt and pants, black shoes, cap and belt with a pistol and baton on it. He is standing on sandy ground with trees with green leaves in the background. He wears blue gloves and is handing a bottle of water to a dark-skinned boy in a blue plaid shirt, jeans, and dusty black and white gym shoes. The boy has dark hair and his face is blurry. Next to the boy, a darker-skinned woman with her black hair in a low bun stands facing the boy in a blue, green, yellow, and white striped shirt, blue jeans, gray and pink gym shoes, and small earrings. Behind the man in green, two other light-skinned men in green uniforms can be seen, one with no cap and another in a cap and sunglasses. They are standing amidst 7 other darker-skinned people, dressed in pants, shirts, and blurry faces, or looking away. One of them is holding a water bottle and another holds a red cup. Figure 15. 28 migrants at the U.S. southern border. Many migrants who have crossed the southern border of the United States since 2020 have traveled far from countries including Ecuador, Brazil, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Haiti, and Cuba. Often, like those in this 2014 photo, they are children and arrive alone. Credit: Border Patrol agent provides water to unaccompanied alien children by U.S. Customs and Border Protection /Flickr, public domain. State instability and human rights abuses. Many of the migrants arriving at the southern border of the United States are fleeing economic and political disorder in their home countries. This pattern goes back many decades. For example, many thousands of Salvadoran migrants have entered the United States each year, especially during and after the El Salvador Civil War, Figure 15. 29. That war began in 1979 with a military coup supported by the United States, which feared that radical leftist elements in El Salvador were destabilizing the country and leading it in a direction contrary to U.S. Cold War interests. 2 images are shown. Image A shows a map of North and South America with a red box enclosing Central America. A larger topographical map of Central America is also shown. From north to south, the following countries are labeled: Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. Image B is a black and white picture is shown of 4 men with rifles standing amid a crumbled building. The man on the left wears a cap, has solid-colored clothes, and is looking forward. The next man wears a plaid shirt, dark pants, and has black bushy hair. The third man is facing the other 3 and wears a backpack with a flashlight attached at the top. His clothes are solid-colored and dark bushy hair is seen under his cap. The last man on the right is facing forward and wears a 2-toned cap with solid clothes. Figure 15. 29. El Salvador Civil War. The Civil War in El Salvador greatly destabilized the country and led to a surge in Salvadorans seeking asylum in the United States. B. The soldiers in the photo are members of the Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo, People's Revolutionary Army, one of 5 left-wing groups that made up the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. Credit A left. Modification of work CIA Map of Central America by CIA The World Factbook, Regional Maps /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit A right. Modification of work World Map Blank Shorelines by Maciej Jaros /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit B. Modification of work ERP Combatants in Perquin, El Salvador in 1990 by Linda Hess Miller /Wikimedia Commons, CC by 3.0. By supporting the coup with money, military training, and the sharing of intelligence reports, the United States hoped to return stability to El Salvador, but the opposite occurred. Many in El Salvador felt the military government was illegitimate and staged protests and resistance. The military responded with violence of its own, such as a deadly attack on demonstrators in 1980. There were also rightist paramilitary groups, often referred to as death squads, fighting against leftist guerrilla forces in the countryside and committing murders and massacres. As the country descended into chaos, many left and found refuge in the United States. Today these immigrants number about 2.5 million. A similar pattern of civil war and instability in other parts of Central America has also produced human rights abuses and an increase in migration to the United States. The Guatemalan Civil War, 1960–1996, for example, led to numerous human rights violations against Guatemalans. These included a reported campaign of violence and terrorism by the government against ethnic Mayans and peasants accused of supporting leftist guerrilla groups. Nicaragua has experienced destabilization since the 1960s as well. Leftist guerrilla organizations fought against the dictatorship of the Somoza family, which ruled until the late 1970s. Then, in 1979, one of the major leftist groups, the Sandinistas, took control. The Sandinistas were socialists, and within months they had opened diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and later accepted its economic and military assistance. This action alarmed the United States and led it to support resistance to the Sandinista government, which contributed to an escalation of the violence and a number of human rights abuses on both sides. Link to learning. The long-term consequences of the war in El Salvador are still obvious today. Watch this brief news report to learn about some of them. While violence in Central America has declined in the last few decades, it persists elsewhere. Venezuela, effectively a one-party state since 2007, has been accused by the United States of a number of human rights abuses. These include murder, imprisonment, torture, and government support of armed groups that commit violence against protesters. Similar accusations have been made against the governments in Colombia, Cuba, Ecuador, Peru, and Chile. Chile's government committed numerous human rights abuses against its people during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, 1973–1990. These included torture, execution, and sexual abuse of leftist political opponents. While Pinochet has since died, human rights organizations claim the abuses continue, particularly against indigenous groups and those identifying as LGBTQ+. Similar human rights abuses committed by authoritarian governments are also a persistent reality across much of Africa. Between April and July 1994, nearly 800,000 people were killed in Rwanda, when an estimated 200,000 members of the Hutu majority sought to wipe out the minority Tutsi population and any Hutus who tried to protect them. Armed conflicts in countries like Liberia, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Nigeria, and Somalia have also led to many human rights violations. In a number of countries, militant Islamic organizations have committed civilian massacres and targeted killings. These include attacks by Boko Haram, the Islamic State in West Africa, and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, which have been responsible for many hundreds of deaths over the last few years. In response, the governments in these countries have committed atrocities of their own. For example, in 2021, government forces in the Central African Republic attacked a mosque and killed 14 people. Governments across Africa have often used violence to break up anti-government protests. For example, in the small southern African country of Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, government forces broke up a pro-democracy protest in 2021, killing 80 people and injuring more than 200. Many more who protested the regime of the Eswatini King Mswati III were arrested, figure 1530. Similar actions against protesters in Sudan that year led to the deaths of 53 people. and other government abuses across the continent have resulted in long prison sentences and even death for protesters, whistleblowers, and journalists who have challenged government policies. A picture of a dark-skinned man with dark hair and a horseshoe-shaped, black mustache is shown. He wears no shirt, has various leis and necklaces around his neck, and tassels in bright yellow, blue, and orange hang on his right arm. 8 rows of pink beads hang across his chest from his right shoulder to his waist at the left. The top of his chest has brown skin tags all over, and his belly protrudes over a black belt with a gold buckle. Black and white animal print fur hangs below his waist over a black cloth with orange and white circles. On the underside of his right wrist, a black watch band can be seen, and he is holding a tall brown stick with a white bottom and white ring around the top. The top of his left arm is adorned with a black, yellow, and orange cloth, and he wears a gold plain ring on the third finger of his left hand, which holds a thin, dark stick. A dark-skinned man stands behind him with an open mouth and his head hanging down. He has dark hair, wears a black and white animal fur around his head, with orange feathers coming off the front and several necklaces and adornments around his neck. He holds a tall stick with a rounded top. Behind both men, a red brick wall stands with white trim at the top, and 3 other people are shown standing behind it, 2 in light-colored short-sleeved shirts, and 1 with a bare chest, beads, and a patterned cloth below the waist holding a stick in his hand. Figure 15. 30 King Mswati III of Eswatini. King Mswati III has been condemned by many international observers as an absolute monarch who rules with an iron fist. As this 2006 photograph shows, he also skillfully uses the symbols of his country to strengthen his hold on power. Credit: King Mswati III 2006 by Amada44/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In Asia, Myanmar and China demonstrate that human rights violations can emerge where racial and religious prejudices against minorities are pronounced. The Rohingya people, a Muslim minority living in predominantly Buddhist Myanmar, have faced oppression for generations, including being officially excluded from citizenship in 1982. Because they are a small minority and viewed with suspicion by the larger Buddhist population, they have long been vulnerable to attacks. In 2017, brutality against the Rohingya escalated dramatically and triggered a mass migration of more than 700,000 to neighboring Bangladesh. As of 2022, nearly 1 million Rohingya people were still living in large refugee camps there. Figure 1531. A picture shows a circular group of dark-skinned men standing with a light-skinned man and woman on the right side in front of the semicircle. The dark-skinned men are dressed in various short-sleeved printed shirts and short-sleeved polos. Some have glasses, some wear white hats, and some have facial hair. The woman wears a dark coat, light blue scarf, has blonde shoulder-length hair and small earrings. She is holding her hands out in front of her. A man stands to her left in a plaid white and blue shirt, dark glasses, and short, black hair looking down. A man to her right holds a pad of paper and a pen. Toward the middle of the crowd, several people hold up cameras, video recorders, and phones. In the background on the left stands a building with a large banner in front. Cars can be seen in the far back, and a purple large tarp with a white and yellow flower covers a large rectangle structure toward the middle right of the photo. Figure 15. 31 Rohingya refugees. Rohingya refugees from Myanmar have struggled to draw global attention to their plight. In 2015, their representatives at a Sumatra refugee camp spoke with Ann C. Richards, the Obama administration's Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. Credit: Assistant Secretary for Population, Migration, and Refugees, Ann C. Richard visiting Rohingya refugee camp in Aceh by U.S. Embassy, Jakarta/Flickr, public domain. Another case of state-sponsored abuse against an ethnic minority is the oppression of the Uyghurs of China. Figure 15. 32. The Uyghurs number about 11 million and are a mostly Muslim ethnic group of Turkic origin living in northwestern Xinjiang. The Chinese government has repressed them for decades, claiming that many hold extremist ideas about carving out their own Islamic state, which China views as a threat to its territorial integrity. Chinese policy has been to compel the Uyghurs to conform their religious beliefs more thoroughly to the state's nationalist message, and to eliminate separatist movements. Since at least as early as 2017, China has rounded up several 100,000 Uyghurs and placed them in what it calls vocational training centers. Human rights groups, however, have described these as re-education camps intended to compel the Uyghurs to renounce Islam and become loyal Chinese citizens. Relatively little is known about the many camps because the state controls information and denies that abuse occurs within them. A picture shows people carrying a large white banner on a street in front of a large monument with a green statue on top, trees, and a tall building on the right. The banner reads, "Over 1 million Uyghurs disappeared in China," in black, and then, "Where are out missing family and friends?" in red across the bottom. Several people hold the banner wearing suits, coats, hats, and scarves. They also hold flags as they carry the banner. The flags are mostly blue with a moon and star on them, and 3 are checkered in various pastel colors and 1 is red. At the left of the banner, a man in a wheelchair holds a blue flag. In the left back is a white banner with the words "Honkingers in German Concern" on it, with some of the letters hidden by other flags. Figure 15. 32 Support for China's Uyghur people. In China, protesting the treatment of Uyghurs is strictly prohibited by the government. These marchers in Germany called attention to their plight in 2020. Credit: Demonstration for the Rights of the Uyghurs in Berlin 2020 0119 by Leonhard Lentz / Wikimedia Commons, CC 01. 0. Women and girls often face the brunt of violence when instability reigns, or when states sponsor oppression against minorities. Both Rohingya and Uyghur women have described sexual abuse perpetrated by the state or with its tacit approval. In 2014, the world condemned the Islamic terrorist group Boko Haram's attack on a girls' high school in Nigeria and its kidnapping of 276 mostly Christian female students, many of whom were forced into marriages with Boko Haram members or sold into sexual slavery. Those who escaped have described beatings, sexual assaults, and torture. While this event captured global attention, including from First Lady Michelle Obama, many similar kidnappings have occurred before, and since with almost no international coverage at all. Figure 15. 33. A picture shows an African-American woman standing holding a small white paper with "Bring Back Our Girls" written on it in black ink. She has short wavy hair, large hoop earrings, a blue, red, and white flowered dress, and a diamond ring on her left hand. In the background, a blurry room is shown with a tall desk, chair, benches, a lamp, and walls decorated with paintings of scenery. A large glass chandelier hangs above her head in the background. Figure 15. 33. A plea for Boko Haram's victims. First Lady Michelle Obama brought much-needed attention to the kidnapping of girls in Africa when she posed for this photograph in the diplomatic reception room at the White House in 2014. Credit: First Lady Michelle Obama holding a sign reading "Bring Back Our Girls" by Michelle Obama, Office of the First Lady / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The situation of women in Afghanistan is particularly dire. Since retaking control of the country in August 2021, following the U.S. military's departure, the Taliban has rolled back virtually all the once protected civil rights of women and girls. Afghan women have been denied access to education, health care, and civil rights, and the right to free expression, freedom of movement, and freedom of association. They are required to completely cover their bodies while outdoors and are routinely inspected by security officials to ensure they are properly clothed and in the company of a male relative. because they are now restricted in the types of jobs they can hold. Many Afghan women have found it difficult to earn enough money to support themselves or their families as they once did. Dueling voices. The debate over veils and head coverings. Whether or not Muslim women should be required, or allowed, to wear veils or head coverings is a contentious issue. In some countries with Muslim-majority populations, such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Afghanistan, the law requires women to veil their heads and/or faces in public. In other Muslim countries, however, women can choose whether to do so. Muslim women living in the West also must confront the question of whether to cover their heads and faces in public. Sometimes government authorities do not give them a choice. In 2004, France banned the wearing of veils in public schools, and in 2011 it banned veils that cover the entire face, as did Belgium. Women cannot work for the French government while veiled, nor can anyone wearing an overtly religious symbol such as a crucifix or skullcap. French authorities claim these bans ensure the secular nature of the French state, a bedrock principle dating from the French Revolution, and enshrined in Article 1 of the French Constitution of 1958. Supporters of women's right to veil argue that such laws are a backlash against Muslim immigrants and disproportionately affect Muslim women, and they point out that French public schools celebrate Christian holidays. While conservative politicians generally support the bans, some liberals would prevent veiled women from working in day care centers, and the socialist junior minister for women's rights questioned whether veils should be allowed in universities. Muslim women themselves are divided in their opinions. Some consider veils symbols of oppression and argue that they can be good Muslims without covering themselves. One New York City woman explained, "I am a Muslim woman, and I have never worn a veil, nor has my mother or her sisters. While we are devoted to Islam, we believe that God exists on the inside and not in outward symbols that are too often thwarted and perverted by political interests." Many others voluntarily choose to wear veils or headscarves and do not feel pressured to do so. They consider them a symbol of their cultural identity or religious piety. One young Muslim American woman explained to the New York Times, "I chose to start wearing the veil 3 years ago, even though the girls in my family don't. I chose to wear it myself after I studied Islam and thought it was a beautiful way to express my love for my religion and nothing more." Why did France ban full-face veils? Do you find the government's arguments convincing? Do you think banning religious symbols is the best way to achieve the separation of church and state? Why or why not? Global North and Global South. The reality for many people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America is a stark reminder of the wide gulf between what some refer to as the Global North and the Global South. These labels describe the rough geographic pattern evident in the global distribution of the world's richest and poorest countries. Most of the richest countries, such as the United States, Canada, and the EU countries, are in the north, while poorer countries predominate in the south, figure 15. 34. However, there are also wealthy countries such as Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore in the southern hemisphere, so the terms actually reflect economic realities and not geography. Furthermore, while not all people living in Global South countries are poor, those that earn only a fraction of what the average person in a Global North country earns. The world is complicated and complexity resists simple categorizations. A map of the world is shown. The United States, Canada, Greenland, Europe, Northern Asia, and Australia are highlighted blue, and Central America, South America, Africa, and South Asia are highlighted red. Antarctica is highlighted yellow. Figure 15. 34. The Global North and the Global South. When people speak of the Global North, shown in blue in this map, they mean mostly wealthy Western countries. With a few exceptions, the Global South, shown in red, means mostly poorer countries, some of which were once colonized by European imperial powers. Credit, modification of work, World Map Blank Shorelines by Maciej Jaros/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Many of the economic problems in the Global South can be traced to imperial exploitation, sometimes going back centuries. Countries in the Global North, especially in Europe, tended to reap the benefits of this exploitation. The legacy of colonialism and imperialism in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Southern Asia continues to affect these countries in the form of high levels of government corruption, poorly developed industries, and borders drawn for the benefit of imperialist powers rather than by the groups living there. In Africa, borders charted to benefit imperialist powers often separated members of the same ethnic group into different countries, while forcing hostile groups into the same country. Violent ethnic conflict has been a frequent result. Even Global South countries that are resource-rich have struggled to develop their economies over the past few decades. Indeed, they often have more difficulty responding to their domestic needs than countries that are relatively resource-poor. This problem, sometimes dubbed the resource curse, a term coined by British economist Richard Audie in 1993, makes resource-rich countries prone to authoritarianism, high rates of conflict, and low rates of economic growth. Resource-poor countries typically use citizens' taxes for the majority of government funding, resulting in greater public scrutiny over how that money is used and governments that are more responsive to public needs. In contrast, governments in resource-rich countries are able to tap into profit-producing extractive industries like oil production to fund public expenditures. Because that profit is often quite large, opportunities for government corruption abound. Efforts to capture more profit also contribute to conflict and sometimes authoritarian regimes, as politicians use money to reward political supporters and fund security forces that silence opponents and stamp out protest. There is also typically less public scrutiny of potential corruption, linked to learning. The resource curse is a complicated problem that scholars and others continue to try to solve. To better understand the issue, take a look at this insightful short interview with Leif Wenar in which he discusses the resource curse. Wenar is the author of Blood Oil, Tyrants, Violence, and the Rules That Run the World. The African country of Angola, rich in diamonds and oil, has struggled with the resource curse. In 2018, oil made up more than 92% of its exports, and the oil industry accounted for about a third of its GDP. Since achieving independence from Portugal in 1975, the country has experienced internal wars and massacres. For much of this period, until 2017, Angola was ruled by José Eduardo dos Santos, who was routinely criticized internationally for election fraud, corruption, and authoritarianism. Much of his power was derived from the oil rents paid to him by oil companies operating in Angola, which he used to oppress his opposition, maintain his hold on power, and shower his family and close contacts with favors and money. The oil rents were substantial, but relatively little of this money actually trickled down to the country's largely impoverished people, figure 15. 35. Strife also weakened Angola's ability to feed itself. Famine conditions prevailed in the 1980s and 1990s, and many educated and skilled workers left for opportunities abroad. In 2019, the percentage of the population below the national poverty line was 41%. 30% of adults had not completed primary schooling, and 53% of the country had no access to electricity. A picture is shown of a basic brick and stone structure with uncovered door and window openings that lead to the outside and a pieced-together tin roof. The background shows trees and other simple structures. Through the openings in the structure, a plastic white table is seen with a plastic blue chair on the left. In the middle, a window opening shows a ledge with a green plastic basket, a bottle, and two pots sitting on a tarp. A red and white sign hangs by the opening with a picture of a bottle on it and the words Coca-Cola, written in cursive in white, and a white wavy stripe running under the words. In the forefront on the bottom left, there is a pile of wood and an axe lying in front of a bowl. In the middle forefront, there is a fire surrounded by rocks with a black simple grill above it. Various charred meats cover the grill. Behind the grill, a dark-skinned woman stands facing the back in a pink skirt and maroon shirt with a blue cloth tied on her head. To her right, a dark-skinned girl stands with braids, white shirt, flip-flops, and a maroon-patterned cloth around her waist. 3 men and a woman are seen by the doorway to the right going in and out. The men wear drab polo shirts, dark jeans and pants, and one wears a large brown cowboy hat. The woman wears a green shirt and plaid skirt. A blue and white bowl and 2 pots are seen in the bottom right of the picture, along with a large piece of wood. Figure 15. 35 Poverty in resource-rich Angola. Despite their enormous natural riches, the people of Angola continue to live in great poverty, as in this typical village in the country. Credit: Street Scene Angola Village by Paulo Cesar Santos /Wikimedia Commons, CC01. 0. While Angola is an extreme case, its problems are generally representative of those in many countries across the global south, including those unaffected by the resource curse. As of 2015, approximately 85% of the world's extreme poor, those living on less than $1.90 per day, lived in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and half of them lived in just 5 countries: India, Bangladesh, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Ethiopia. Many lack access to good quality medical care, infrastructure, educational resources, and communication systems. They face high rates of famine, disease, and death from political instability. They also experience food instability. According to the United Nations, approximately 800 million people faced hunger in 2020, many in the global south. They are also more vulnerable to natural disasters like hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, and heat waves. Their countries are more likely to experience problems related to environmental and industrial pollution, as well as the many effects of climate change. These difficulties have been at least partially alleviated by the efforts of international organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF. The World Bank has encouraged community-driven development by supporting government planning and investments that prioritize a bottom-up approach. It has helped countries manage the problem of persistent natural disasters, such as financing early warning systems for tsunamis in Southeast Asia. And it has provided funds to meet educational needs, to provide infrastructure for clean water, and to combat hunger by boosting agricultural production. Similarly, the IMF has provided a pool of monetary resources countries can access when they fall into financial difficulties. While both organizations can point to their many achievements, they have occasionally made problems worse. Critics like the economist Joseph Stiglitz, for instance, point to the many conditions the IMF imposes on countries when it comes to help. These include increased privatization, elimination of protectionist policies, higher interest rates, and austerity measures that reduce government spending. Such conditions, Stiglitz and others have noted, tend to benefit foreign creditors from the global north and hurt poor workers in the countries the IMF purports to be saving. Similar criticisms have been directed against the World Bank. Many have argued that the organization lacks representation from the global south, so poor countries have relatively little influence within the organization and on its policies and actions.